3 minutes after 10 is the time. A very good morning indeed to you. A slightly odd show today in that I'm not entirely sure that there are going to be any invitations or reasons for you to call me. And I have nowhere near enough material to get... Well, I have more than enough material to get the topic we're going to start with up and running, and indeed probably running all the way to 11 o'clock. But it would not be conventional radio. It would just be me playing a succession of clips from a succession of records and archives and focusing attention on a frankly remarkable story. And it is a story that has been bubbling away now for 5 years, receiving curious levels of interest and indeed inconsistent levels of interest. For example, there was a brief 3-year period, when the Daily Mail was not edited by a Boris Johnson fixated psychopath. And during that period, they carried the following headline. Dishevelled Boris Johnson was seen barely able to walk and holding war strategy manual in Italian airport after partying at Russian billionaire Evgeny Lebedev's villa when he was foreign secretary. Now, I don't know that it is actually Evgeny Lebedev's villa. I think it's Alexander Lebedev's villa, although the source of their fortunes is the same. Alexander Lebedev, of course, is the former KGB spy, at which point altogether now, what did Vladimir Putin say about former KGB spies? He said there is no such thing as a former KGB spy. Alexander Lebedev has now been sanctioned in Canada and in Ukraine as a key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle, whereas his son was put in the House of Lords by Boris Johnson, despite advice from the intelligence services that he shouldn't do that. So back to 2018, it was in March that Jeremy Corbyn was slammed for his prevarication over the Russian attempts to poison the Skripal family in Salisbury. And a month later, with rather less media brouhaha, present company accepted, Boris Johnson was at a party, having dispensed with his own security services. The serving Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom went directly from a NATO summit to the home of a KGB spy, a former KGB spy, where he partied in circumstances that other witnesses and other attendees, including, I kid you not, Katie Price and Joan Collins, have described in, well, fairly bacchanalian terms. And apart from one or two corners of the British media, everyone's been urging you to look away. The Daily Mail, of course, have recently hired Boris Johnson as a columnist, so it's highly unlikely they'll be turning much attention to this story anytime soon. Thankfully, Channel 4 did last night. You'll remember that Nadine Dorries, who will be featuring later in the programme in a sparkling new corner of the show, you'll remember that she was desperate to essentially close down Channel 4 or at least to change its funding model or change its setup completely. Why? Because it is one of the only places that does the job that all of the media should be doing. They turned their attention to this story last night. Here are the 4 people whose voices you are about to hear. Okay, pay attention. This is important. And also, while you're paying attention, try and come up with a way that I can turn this into a phone-in, all right? Because I'm sick of doing all the work around here. You are about to hear the voices of Lord Simon MacDonald, a former permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the most senior civil servant, in other words, in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. You're about to hear from Lord David Clark, a former member of the House of Lords Appointments Commission. You are about to hear from Lord George Foulkes, a member of the Intelligence and Security Select Committee between 2007 and 2010. And you are about to hear from Dennis Molinaro, a former analyst at the Canadian Secret Intelligence Services. Pin back your ears.
I did not know in April 2018 that Boris Johnson intended to go to Italy to see the Lebedevs immediately after a NATO summit. The only explanation seemed to be that Mr. Lebedev's newspaper was close and supportive of Mr. Johnson.
He tried to overrule, and did overrule, his security advisors and the House of Lords Appointment Commission.
Boris Johnson put himself in the direct line of being able to be influenced and compromised.
I've never heard of officials seeking a meeting to discuss these issues.
Russia has clearly played a long game, has clearly tried to buy influence in the United Kingdom.
Her heirs and successors according to law.
If you have politicians that can be compromised by foreign states, it could lead to sharing of secrets, it could lead to steering of policy in their interests, it could lead to a fracturing of an alliance that the West has depended on to maintain the current international order and system. And if that goes, we don't have much left.
Okay, you're still with me at the back? This is the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, a position he achieved after being Foreign Secretary, which is the job he held at the time of the story that's being discussed. You heard there his then permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office saying he had no idea that the Foreign Secretary was making his way from a NATO summit to the home of a Russian spy, a former KGB agent. Okay? Now, in July of 2022, Johnson appeared before the Home Affairs Select Committee, where the chair, Diana Johnson, started asking him some questions about it, questions that were then followed up by the Labour MP Meg Hillier. And I want you to listen to this now, and I want you to imagine towards the end that Boris Johnson's lawyer, who was sitting behind him in the room, scribbled furiously on a piece of paper and handed it to Boris Johnson as he was speaking. I would speculate that what the lawyer wrote on that piece of paper was quite probably, "Stop talking now."
Just my final question, if I may. Could you just confirm, and I just appreciate a yes or a no, that you met with the former KGB officer Alexander Lebedev when you were Foreign Secretary without officials on the 28th of April 2018?
Well, I'd have to check, but.
Are you having a lapse of memory again?
No, but that's. But you know, if you're asking me a very specific question about a very specific date, and I'd have to get back. I certainly have met the gentleman in question, who's
without officials,
who used to be the proprietor of the London Evening Standard. When I was Mayor of London, so I certainly am not going to deny having met Alexander Lebedev. I certainly have. As far as I remember, he used to own the London Evening Standard.
Yes, but with officials when you were Foreign Secretary. Did you meet with officials or without officials?
Look, I've certainly met him without officials.
Right.
And you know, as I say, he's a
perhaps you could write to us
proprietor of a
perhaps you could write to us with a specific answer.
Very happy to
specific answer to that very specific question.
Yes.
Meg Hillier.
Yes, can I just follow that up? Prime Minister, I mean, you said you met her without officials. Was that presumably was when you were Mayor of London? When you were Foreign Secretary, did you meet Alexander Lebedev?
I think I probably did, but
probably did.
As I said, I would need to check.
You used to regularly meeting him. I mean, is it probably because you meet him often, or probably because you can't remember?
I've met him on a very few occasions.
As Foreign Secretary,
on the occasion you're mentioning, if that was when I was Foreign Secretary, then yes.
Without officials.
Yes, I mean, that makes sense.
Did you report to your officials that you had met him?
I think I did mention it, yes.
And where did you meet him?
I met him in Italy, as it happens, but I really, I forget. Anyway.
Well, perhaps you'll write to us.
Personal engagement, was it?
Yeah. That's
personal
exactly right.
In Italy?
No, that's the point at which the piece of paper sort of appeared before him. That was the liaison committee, forgive me, that Boris Johnson was appearing before in July of 2022. The reference to Joan Collins and Katie Price, the artist formerly known as Jordan, may have surprised you, but I think it was a Spectator diary, but it was Joan Collins who has told the story of Katie Price. Forgive me, if there are any children in the car, put your hands over their ears now, baring her breasts at the dinner table at a previous party in this palazzo that Boris Johnson had attended. According to one report, she was well, hang on, it gets better. She did it twice because on the second occasion, Joan Collins asked her to repeat her party trick as fellow guest Boris Johnson, at the time Foreign Secretary in Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's government, had missed it the first time. Okay, so you now know a little bit more than you did 13 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago. If you watched Dispatches on Channel 4 last night, you don't know anything more than you did 10 minutes ago. I wonder what the numbers are I wonder what the percentage of the population is that is aware of this. And I wonder what the percentage of the population would be that cared deeply about this, or at least felt that there were some very, very, very big questions still in need of very, very, very urgent answers if they were fully apprised of all the facts, or even some of the facts that we've just shared. Thanks largely to the work of The Guardian over the years. Carol Cadwallader inevitably was at the front of the queue in pointing this stuff out, but it has been more or less completely ignored by more or less every other corner of the media ever since, up to and including the point where Boris Johnson broke the ministerial code again in accepting a job with the Daily Mail the day after he was found to be the most serial and egregious liar ever to hold the office of Prime Minister. So, how do we do this together today, you and me? How do we talk about this? How do we become one of the tiny corners of the UK media that reflects the importance of this story, or at least the importance that we think it has? You may disagree. You know how this programme works. You are more than welcome to tell me why this is not important, that the serving Foreign Secretary was partying with a Russian spy immediately after attending a NATO summit, and 1 month after Russian agents tried to murder British citizens. Well, they succeeded, didn't they? They killed Dawn Sturgis, but by accident in Salisbury. What would happen in other countries is perhaps one way to start. I don't know where you're listening, and I don't know where you're from, but I do know this. In sort of international league tables of media corruption and or trust, we do abysmally for a supposedly free Western democracy. When you have various racists and conspiracy theorists popping up all over the place, claiming that mainstream media is waging a war against them or keeping the truth about 15-minute cities and the World Economic Forum from the public, you get an idea of what the consequences are when you attack proper journalists and ignore proper stories. What would happen in your country if a very, very... let's go right to the top, because he was a prime minister. What do you think would happen in your country, the country you grew up in or the country you currently live in, a country other than the United Kingdom, if it turned out that the Prime Minister had done the things, a former Prime Minister had done the things that we are absolutely certain that Boris Johnson did? This isn't even speculation. He can't even deny it. Do you know he was photographed the morning after at an Italian airport on his way home? He seemed to have slept in his suit. He was clutching documents that the Daily Mail claimed were a war strategy manual. He sort of appeared beyond dishevelled, even by his own ludicrous standards, sitting in a plastic airport chair, barely able to keep his eyes open before shuffling onto the plane. And this, is supposedly normal behaviour for a former Prime Minister. It's 17 minutes after 10. I want to talk about this until 11, okay? But I can't talk uninterrupted. Even I would struggle to repeat the same story again and again and again in a slightly different order, or perhaps using all the right words but not necessarily in the right order, to paraphrase Eric Morecambe. So I need a question that helps us all come to a slightly better understanding of what has been going on. Rory Stewart has spoken about being invited to an Italian house party there. I know people that went to those parties. They're not politicians. And I can't quite believe that I live in a country not where glamour models and Hollywood actresses enjoy the largesse and hospitality of a KGB man, but where our serving Foreign Secretary, shortly to become Prime Minister, attended in such a indiscreet fashion. So, what would happen? What would happen in your country if it was reported that a former Prime Minister had been knocking about with... Well, how would you explain this to a Ukrainian today? How would you explain this to a Ukrainian? Ukrainians, of course, were very warm towards Boris Johnson because, just like Rishi Sunak, he has offered support to their cause in a full-throated way. Explain to a Ukrainian what Boris Johnson was doing at the home of a man who Ukraine has sanctioned for being part of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Just find a way of keeping this story afloat, keeping this conversation alive for at least another hour, because you know what's going to happen. And this was nearly the question I asked you, but it's too similar to topics that we do every week, which is what's happened to our country? Why would this story not be garnering more attention? We can't do everything from that end of the telescope. Just imagine for a minute, and I'm not big on counterfactuals, but if it had been Jeremy Corbyn at the KGB agents' palazzo while he was merely leader of the opposition as opposed to Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister in waiting, what do you think other media outlets would have done? Other broadcasters, other newspapers? If it had been the former leader of the opposition partying with KGB agents on their way back from a NATO summit, what do you think would be happening? Or even if it was Keir Starmer today, but I think the flavour of coverage of Corbyn was different. It's 19 minutes after 10. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. I don't know if this is going to work or not. That's entirely up to you. But these are the two ways into it that I can think of. What would happen in another country if a former Prime Minister was found to have done the things that Boris Johnson has been found to have done? What would happen? 0345 6060 973. And I mean, what would the media be doing? And quite possibly, what would the authorities be doing? Okay? And then question number 2, have a crack at explaining to either the mythical coma patient that we often use in circumstances like this, or just to a confused Ukrainian. Explain to them how this could happen. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Because none of this is speculation. None of this is pontification. These are all established facts. And yet we sit here wondering why so few of us seem to care. 23 minutes after 10. And of course, much of this territory has been painstakingly, forensically explored by our friend Paul Caruana Galizia on his Tortoise podcast's London Grad. And yet still the revelations keep coming, including this week that Italian security services were monitoring the palazzo where Johnson was partying, and, as we mentioned at the top of the show, that the most senior civil servant in the Foreign Office, the permanent undersecretary at the time, was unaware of the visit by the Foreign Office to the home of a former KGB agent without any security protection. So if this was someone from your country, what would be the response of the media and or the authorities? And just talk to me about it in general, because we've got to do our bit to keep these wheels turning, haven't we? Oh, good God, we've lost so much else. Are we really going to lose what remains of honour and vestige in the British media? The last vestige of honour. Richard's in Horsham. Richard, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, mate. What's on your mind?
Well, it's been done before, isn't it, with the Profumo affair?
Yes, sort of. So for people not familiar with that, the Russian military attaché to London was found to have shared a girlfriend, as it were, with the British Defence Secretary, John Profumo, and he eventually fell upon his sword after being found to have lied to the House of Commons. And that was merely a question of consorting. I don't think there was any more evidence, or nothing was proved beyond that shared contact with Christine Keeler.
No, and that's the difference, James, isn't it? There was, as you have said in many a times in the past, there was honour and dignity in the past.
He would have gone. So I don't know that Johnson is quite on the as sharp or as big a hook as Profumo ended up on, because no one has come forward and said, for example, I think we can say with Johnson's personal life and moral history, we can speculate upon the possibility that he was true to form on his Italian trip and misbehaved, to put it mildly. No one's come forward to say either that or that the person with whom he misbehaved has also misbehaved with Russian agents or Russian diplomats.
But then when you look at the Privilege Committee and everything else, there is a distinct trend, shall we say? I mean, as you said again in the past, this is the boy that wanted to rule the world.
Why is the story not bigger? Just from where you're sitting in Horsham, why is the story not bigger? Why?
Well, it's got to be the press and the media, the way it's been reported or not reported.
It's getting considerably less coverage than Keir Starmer's curry in Durham.
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
why?
I don't know, because It's the funding. It's the people want to stay in power. Power corrupts. We all know that. It's the oldest thing in the world, isn't it? And people, once they get it, they want to hang on to it at any cost.
I don't know. I mean, one would imagine that there'll be conservative politicians, not just conservative voters, listening to this who are just as outraged and disgusted by it as we are. People who perhaps had even been close to the power that Johnson wielded. But the question of why this is not a bigger story, I can't do that every day on the programme because it highlights my own appalling judgment when it comes to deciding what's important and what isn't. But this is a bridge I am prepared to die on. A foreign secretary dispensing with or slipping the clutches of his own security people, not telling his most senior civil servant, fresh from a NATO meeting, turning up at the home of a KGB spy that was under surveillance by Italian security services, and then subsequently ignoring the advice of his own security services to put the son of said spy into the actual House of Lords, where, just for the record, he has done absolutely nothing. It's a funny one, right? Chris is in San Martin in Spain. Chris, thank you, Richard. Chris, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, Jen. Listen, the situation is this. He's front and centre, as you've been describing your programme now.
Yes.
The issue is more key to this, that he has a circle of protectors, whether they're political, social, news media, etc. And they're the ones that have got the greatest fear now, because if you take your piece now... Yeah. It has to be widened in order that you now find why it is that this has taken so long to get to this stage, basically. They're the key factors. In politics, we know that there's a lot of things that are going on that we even don't know 10 years or 20 years after until it gets published, when they die, etc. Now, the other thing as well is you asked the question about, well, what would happen in another country? Yeah. So I'm going to give you an example,
if you would. Yes, please.
Yeah. I have a family friend whose son was a good friend of the husband of one of Berlusconi's daughters.
Okay.
He actually went to that property by invitation with his own girlfriend.
Yes.
And while he was there, he actually met Berlusconi, who was having breakfast in the kitchen. And while they were having the breakfast, yes. He suddenly realized that there were protectors around him, but they weren't, if you like, a private army. They were an army of carabinieri, carrying machine pistols, etc.
So Berlusconi's bodyguards.
Absolutely. So when you find that the Italian state police are protecting Berlusconi, then you know that it is reaching far levels of authority within the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Berlusconi is a helpful example for two reasons, isn't he? Number one, it reminds us that we are now a heck of a lot more like Berlusconi's Italy than we are like,
Absolutely.
I don't know, Margaret Thatcher or Tony Blair's Britain.
Definitely.
But it also reminds us that this habit of wooing power and keeping power close, even in plain sight, was unfolding all the time. So it wouldn't be reported in Italy any better than it's been reported here because Berlusconi owned most of the media, but Boris Johnson doesn't.
No, but he has the Daily Mail now as a protector because they've given him a job, which is against the rules. Now, the other thing as well is there's been a deterioration in British politics for a number of years, particularly in the last 12 or 13 years. And we've seen this and all that's been going on. So the point is this: if he is able still to be able to get, shall we say, away with the latest revelations, then you will begin to see that there is a circle. And the other thing you have to ask yourself is, why haven't the MI5/MI6 been actually following this up? We don't know
that they haven't. We do know that they gave advice on the elevation of Evgeny Lebedev into the House of Lords, and Boris Johnson elected to completely ignore that advice. Again, something that you would think would set off alarm bells. I'm going to do the counterfactual, Chris. I'm not fond of counterfactuals, but sometimes they reach parts that other comments cannot reach. Imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had won the election in 2019 and put the son of a KGB spy straight into the House of Lords against the advice of the intelligence services. Just pause for one moment, and imagine what the rest of the UK media would be doing with that story. He's done what? He won the election in 2019. First thing he's done is put the son of a KGB spy into the House of Lords against the advice of the intelligence services. You see how mad it is now? not done by Johnson, but he is the agent of corruption, as he has always been and always will be. Can you see now? I've spent the last, 10 years searching for the Rosetta Stone to help everybody see how awful this man is and what an appalling impingement upon our country it would be if he were to continue rising through the ranks of British politics. So how about that? How about that now? Imagine it was Jeremy Corbyn. Wins the election in 2019. First thing he does, sticks the son of a KGB spy in the House of Lords against the advice of the intelligence services. Now, regardless of what you think about Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm no fan, or what you think about Boris Johnson, just if you can, shut out all the other noise and imagine what the UK media, what the Daily Mail, the Daily Telegraph, the Times, what would they be doing with that story? 12 pages, 12 front pages about Keir Starmer having a legal curry in County Durham during a by-election campaign. 12 front pages about Keir Starmer's curry. Today, not a single syllable about Boris Johnson, the Lord, and the spy. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 10:35 is the time. Financial Times done great work on this story this week. That's pretty much it, and The Guardian, as you'd expect. Although the Times reviewed last night's dispatches on Channel 4 and reviewed it rather well. The last line, particularly, is very powerful. But it wouldn't answer why. The Lebedevs and Johnson would say the programme is a hatchet job full of Russophobic bias, Borisphobic bias too, and maybe they have a point, but it wouldn't answer why the whole situation stinks like a rancid sturgeon, which is not a reference to Scottish politics, of course, but a reference to the fish from which that famed Russian delicacy caviar is generally derived. I'd read a bit more of it as well because it's helpful. Johnson denied all the allegations made in the investigation, but the reason that he went to the Lebedev's party without security against all protocol remains unclear. Italy's intelligence service had been monitoring the villas with a leaked report explaining why, as does any justifiable reason as to why he was so hell-bent on giving Evgeny Lebedev a peerage against all the red flags. We saw a letter, this is in the Channel 4 show last night, to Johnson from the Lords Appointment Commission telling him the huge security concerns and risks. And it was reported that this merely infuriated Boris Johnson. 10:36 is the time. What I am going to ask, why is this not a bigger story? Although I think the answers are fairly obvious. But more helpful, perhaps, will be to ask, how would it be reported in a different country? How would it be reported in another country? And quite a few of you pointing out that George Osborne was, of course, made editor of the London Evening Standard by Evgeny Lebedev after he ceased to be Chancellor of the Exchequer. I mean, there is one wonderful line in last night's dispatches where there's a clip of a newsreader saying, with a raised eyebrow, sort of Roger Moore-style raised eyebrow, some have questioned if a British paper should be owned by a former KGB spy. I remember thinking at the time, that's a bit, you can't, I mean, the PR at the time was that because one of the papers Lebedev had owned in Russia was, I think, quite cool towards Putin. It was quite critical of Putin. The PR at the time was that the family were enemies of the state in Russia. But goodness me, if you were seeking to inveigle your way into the UK media, speaking entirely theoretically now, it wouldn't be that hard to cast yourself as a critic of Vladimir Putin. If you're allowed to be a critic of Vladimir Putin without being thrown in jail like our friend Vladimir Karamurza, then there's already something fishy going on, let alone if you're still allowed to move all your money around the world with freedom, and then, lo and behold, you pop up in London buying newspapers from, of course, the parent company of the Daily Mail. You couldn't make it up, could you? Well, I'm not. Ben's in Glastonbury. Ben, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi James. Great to speak to you.
Are you stuck there, mate? Have you been there all weekend? Are you still stuck? Are you waiting for a lift?
I'm not actually. I've not been to the festival for many years.
You live in Glastonbury, do you?
It's very close to Glastonbury. Yeah.
Have you got your village back yet?
Yeah, totally.
Good. Glad to hear it.
You know, just as we like it.
Glad to hear it.
Just a big thanks to you, James. Thanks to you, because it's you're saying about not much of the media is shining a light on this, but actually it's because of your show and that I'd kind of started this journey into lots of other commentators and podcasts, etc.
Good.
Of course, London Grads won.
Yes.
That I just ate that up. But also because of Bill Browder's work,
Yes.
I just cannot believe how. You put him on the show a lot, which is fantastic. But he needs a voice in this more than anybody, because once I'd read both his books and really studied his life work, you start to realise and you can start to tie certain things together regarding how powerful Russia are with their propaganda, for example, and how it served them. So the one thing that, having read, I probably read Bill Browder's both of his books, Freezing Point and Red Notice, a couple of times before I suddenly thought, do you know what? This is massive. This is going to cause some controversy, but it's Brexit. That for me was like a light bulb moment. At the point where we were, being given the choice to stay in or leave, Russia were facing, where they were staring down the Magnitsky Act being brought into the UK, and actually, Europe went for it. Obviously, now, once you read the all about this and about Bill Browder's work, you realise that the Russian oligarchs need Europe to spend their money, to enjoy their money, and actually, one of the places that they're big on is the UK. There's
it's
so
the biggest.
much.
That's where the London grad line comes. By far the biggest. It's the biggest laundromat in the world for filthy Russian money. Has been for years.
Absolutely. So what happens if we bring in Magnitsky? Then we have to sanction all these oligarchs.
We saw what would happen under Magnitsky when they invaded Ukraine, because the sort of sanctions that Bill had been calling for finally appeared as a consequence of war rather than as a consequence of the corruption.
And yet, when we did bring in sanctions, did we not give all these oligarchs 6 months to move their money or something like that?
Yeah, I mean they weren't. There may not have been a guillotine, but neither was it a blunt. Neither was it a blunt instrument. I mean, they did work in some corners, but of course, what's his chops? Lebedev hasn't been sanctioned in London. He's been sanctioned in Canada and Ukraine. How do you think another country would deal with a former Prime Minister being reported to have been engaged in such shenanigans?
I think of France. Love the country, love France, and I think that if it was, a French minister or Prime Minister, it'd be slaughtered. I think that they'd be out on the streets. I think that the media would be all over it, and it's, the fact that Brexit, Boris Johnson, how that works for Russia. The Daily Mail, it's all just, it's too closely aligned for me. The Conservative Party know how much money they've accepted from Russian wealth.
There are people paying fortunes to play tennis with Boris Johnson or indeed David Cameron. And, of course, the question of Russian interference in the Brexit referendum, I can't remember whether it was May or Johnson that gave the order not to properly investigate it. There's no point. It's done now. It's all water under the bridge, which is... Ben, thank you for the kind words. I'm a seagull following the trawler on this stuff, and indeed on all stuff. But it's nice to know that this is the aperture through which you've been able to discover all of the other stuff. And just like you, it was my first interview, Bill, years ago, yonks ago. Do you know what happened? He was sitting in a taxi listening to this show by accident. And speaking of taxis, hello to Mark, who got me home last night. That was very, very enjoyable chat. Cheers, mate, and congrats on your daughter getting into that school. That's wonderful news. We got a call. The producer got a call. I've just said there's this bloke. I tell this story quite a lot. I tell it every year actually at the Magnitsky Awards. So the producer said we've had a call off a bloke. Says he really knows what's going on in Russia. And I said, yeah, of course he does. We get calls like that all the time. Do you remember the lady who thought she had a cure for cancer in a Tupperware box in the back of her fridge? You've got to treat. I've told you before. You've got to treat these people with a bit of scare. He said, well, I've invited him on the show. I said, you've done what? He's coming on tomorrow. He wants to come in and talk to you. I said, have you done any checks on him? Have you done any... you could have done due diligence. He used to be the biggest investor in Russia. His granddad was the leader of the American Communist Party. I said, mate, this he's obviously a prankster or a fantasist. There's no way that someone's just randomly ringing into the radio station because they were listening to the show in a taxi and then turns out to be the world's leading critic of Vladimir Putin, determined to actually bring him to justice. And then he came in, he spoke to me, and the pieces began to fall into place. We've been doing it on the programme ever since. And now Bill Browder pops up everywhere. You see him quite rightly being turned to for expert analysis on stories like this and anything related to Russia or indeed to oppressive regimes around the world, you see him popping up absolutely everywhere, and it's incredibly gratifying. But as Ben says, once you start looking into this stuff, it's impossible to properly process because we live here. You live where? You live in a country where the Foreign Secretary can go from a NATO summit to the home of a KGB spy and not bring any security staff with him and not tell his senior civil servant and party so enthusiastically that the next morning he looks like he's about to drop dead in the middle of an Italian airport wearing a suit that he appears to have been sleeping in for the last month. If Boris Johnson looks scruffy by Boris Johnson standards, that's almost a platonic form of scruffiness, right? And I'm not a critic of scruffiness. There's nothing wrong with being scruffy, but goodness me, to look that bad after a night carousing speaks of some serious carousing. And then he comes back, carries on being Foreign Secretary, resigns out of ambition and personal advancement, becomes Prime Minister, which was the plan all along, and lo and behold, he puts the son of said spy straight into the House of Lords against the advice of the intelligence services. Perfectly normal country. 10:48 is the time. I don't think we mention her enough. Every time we mention the Skripals and the attempted poisoning of those two British citizens by Russian spies, we should always mention Dawn Sturgis, who of course was killed as a consequence of their actions, albeit by accident. 44-year-old Dawn Sturgis. We don't honour her memory enough, I don't think. Why are we talking about her today? Well, we're talking about the fact that shortly after she was essentially murdered by Russian spies who'd been trying to take out the Russian dissident Sergei Skripal, Boris Johnson attended a NATO meeting where I think that was on the agenda, and then made his way directly to the home of a former KGB agent in Italy, which was under surveillance by Italian intelligence, and where he partied so enthusiastically that when he was photographed at the airport the next morning, he looked like he'd been dragged through several hedges backwards. I mean, just a very strange scenario, which becomes stranger still when you remember that shortly after that, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and one of his first acts upon becoming Prime Minister was to put the son of the KGB spy into the House of Lords against the advice of intelligence services. Normally I'd be thinking, crikey, should we have run this by the lawyers? Should we be checking this stuff? I don't need to. That's the mad stuff. It's all there. It's all out in the open. It's all in plain sight. Reported this week that civil servants were so concerned by Johnson's determination to promote Lebedev that they even asked the Queen to intervene to stop it from happening. But the palace felt, it has been reported, that would have involved political interference. It's absolutely bizarre. And I don't even, as someone who's pretty clued up on what's gone on, although I'm not party to any information that's not in the public eye, I don't understand why it doesn't set off at least more alarm bells. Sarah's in High Wycombe. Sarah, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
In times gone by, we would have just called this treason. He is a traitor.
Well, no, we'd need to know what went on in the palazzo, wouldn't we? We couldn't. I don't think you can become a traitor merely by going to a party with a Russian.
But the fact he had no security, the fact he had armloads of literature from NATO.
It looks that way. That has been reported that he was clutching documents that referred to perhaps that NATO meeting that he had been attending. A war strategy manual is how it was described by one newspaper.
But we can see already how he has betrayed the UK over the last few years and would continue. And thank the Lord we have people like you, James, who...
Nothing. No, I'm doing nothing. You're very kind. But talk about Paul... No. Talk about Paul Caruana Galizia. Talk about the people that made the Dispatches programme last night. I just follow them around like a seagull following a fishing trawler. And then I share the spoils with you, Sarah. But I'm just a fish sharer. I'm not a fisherman.
I grew up with reading John Pilger, so
yes.
I just think journalists are amazing.
Some are.
But
why is this not being more widely reported? Because it's got everything. There is no person on the planet who could sell to you the idea that this is a less important or less interesting story than Keir Starmer's perfectly innocuous curry, and yet here we are.
Well,
why?
It shows a lot about the state of the country.
I think it does.
the media. And in fact, if you look, you probably know, but this Trick Awards fiasco last night where...
I know nothing about it, so I was not by any stretch of the imagination a defeated shortlisted finalist. I don't know of what you speak. How dare you raise that? How dare you raise that phantom in my presence? But it does speak to a well, listen, it's a public vote. So you can't be too critical of carefully orchestrated and organised campaigns to make measurably unpopular programmes win awards via internet votes. But yeah, you're right. There are certainly some broadcasters out there who would not be asking questions about this. I think it's fair to say. It is 10:52. Speak of the devil. Bill Browder, the anti-corruption campaigner, chief executive of Hermitage Capital, and crucially for our purposes today, head of the Magnitsky Global Justice Campaign, is on the line. Presumably your ears were burning a moment ago, Bill, as Ben in Glastonbury credited you with turning him on to the full extent of Russian infiltration into British high society, and then the subsequent importance of Magnitsky sanctions. But I'm just wondering what you make personally of the latest revelations regarding Boris Johnson and Alexander Lebedev and the parties, the visits, the Italian intelligence services, and the unanswered questions.
Well, it's scandalous. Not to overstate it. I mean, it's the fact that you have I know Alexander Lebedev. I knew him when I was living in Russia. He was a KGB officer. It was former KGB officers who then got rich as the sort of Soviet Union disintegrated. And his wealth was then the basis for his investments in the UK from this sort of connections. And then his son takes over these businesses, and his son then has all these relationships with Boris Johnson and other members of British establishment, and then this guy becomes a member of the House of Lords against the advice of the security services and various other people. It's scandalous by any, you just put all that together. I don't think anyone would argue that it's not scandalous.
No, you're probably better placed to answer the next question than anybody else in the world. What would happen in other countries if an actual Prime Minister was found to have been engaged in this sort of behaviour? And of course, in plain sight as well, the elevation into the House of Lords, despite the advice of intelligence services, it's a very big quo. We may not know what the quid is, but there's an awful lot of pro in the middle.
I'm not sure what should happen to prime ministers, because prime ministers seem to get away with a lot of stuff here. But what I can say with 100% certainty is that this individual should have never been allowed to enter the House of Lords. It should have been shut down. I mean, it's not just scandalous. I mean, if we're going to say that the prime minister shouldn't have done it, we should also say that who was sort of guarding the situation in the civil service. I mean, how can that be allowed to happen? Everybody, head should roll across the board for this thing.
Well, except they didn't know. Lord Simon MacDonald told Dispatches last night that Johnson just simply didn't tell him that he was going along to Lebedev's castle without his security detail. Bill, if Lebedev had been sanctioned in London in the same way that he has been sanctioned in Canada and Ukraine, what would that mean for his commercial interests here? Or would the fact that they have been separated and settled upon the Sun, would that insulate his holdings and his businesses here from sanctions?
Yes, that's exactly the strategy. Try to save themselves from this.
There
was one oligarch.
We're losing the line,
Hello?
Bill. I know you're always on your travels. You're always busy. We got the bulk of what we were hoping to get from you, but the phone line has defeated us in the end. We may return to that question at a later. Is he still there? We'll try once more. We'll carry on, Bill.
Still here. Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I was saying that oligarchs always try to put stuff in kids' names in order to avoid sanctions. It's like a common policy. We've seen this with many others, and then you have to sanction the kids in order to be effective in the whole sanctions program.
So that would involve sanctioning a member of the House of Lords.
Well, indeed it would, and perhaps that's the way to get tough on that situation like this. Just because he's a member of the House of Lords shouldn't excuse him from any sanctions if he has connections that are sanctionable.
Remarkable. Thank you, Bill Browder, as always. And as I say, thank you for being one of the earliest voices to be sounding the alarm about some of these issues. many moons ago, after, of course, the murder of your friend and colleague Sergei Magnitsky in a Russian jail. A spokesperson for Johnson told the Financial Times that proper process was followed and there were no concerns about Lord Lebedev, adding that Lebedev was a UK citizen who has invested in British journalism, and said that HOLAC and security advice was not overruled. This is a tiresome and xenophobic campaign, the spokesperson said. This in response to reports including the Labour peer who was on HOLAC at the time, saying that Johnson's attempt to overrule the security advisors was probably unheard of in modern times. He added, "I've never heard of officials seeking a meeting with Her Majesty to discuss these issues. We've got to remember these people. They are aware of things which you and I aren't aware of. They were really concerned about this. They thought it was a major mistake." Last word to Paul in Stoke. Paul, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to speak to you. I'm a big fan.
Oh, that's very kind. What's on your mind?
One thing that doesn't get mentioned in this story so much is that the meeting that Johnson left, the NATO meeting, I'm not for one second saying that meeting was called to discuss the Skripals, but it was discussed there.
Yes, of course.
And I think it led to NATO countries worldwide suspending something like, I think the figure I've got in my head is 400 Russian diplomats across the NATO countries. And we did what we did. I'm not sure Johnson did what Johnson did.
We expelled some, but the Foreign Secretary was partying a month later.
It's irrelevant whether we expelled any or not. He still did what he did. But the point I was going to make was, and I'm sort of spitballing here.
Go on.
So
on national radio with the lawyers listening. You crack on, Paul.
Spitballing. But imagine a scenario where Lebedev said to Johnson, I own the Evening Standard. We could support Brexit. Maybe there's something in the way. Maybe as a peerage for my son, something like that. Knowing the morals of Johnson, I think we know what he might have said to such a suggestion.
I don't think that's spitballing. The idea that the idea arrived unprompted in his head, independent of any associations whatsoever with Lebedev Senior, is, I think, a bit too fanciful even for one of Nadine Dorries' columns. Isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, the whole thing is just unbelievable.
Well, thank you, and thank you for the kind words, and also thank you to Onkar for letting me know that we've managed to crash the Channel 4 website. So many requests have there been in the last hour for people to watch the dispatches from last night. You're not supposed to watch it while I'm still on the radio, you clowns. Honestly. It's ridiculous. I'm not doing PR for Channel 4. It's a very good programme, but watch it during a quiet moment later in the day or the night. Or I don't know, on the commute. I just stop it. Come back. I'm still here. We've got 2 more hours to go, including PMQs at 12 noon, which should be a good one. And up next, the water companies. I've got Groundhog Day syndrome. When whatever the topic is, there's a large part of me that just wants to shout at you for 5 minutes and then go, how are we letting this happen? I might let myself do that after this. 3 minutes after 11 is the time. The story to which Mel Stride was referring in the news there has been reported by Sky News and the Financial Times. And it is a report that the UK's biggest water firm, Thames Water, is in talks with ministers and Ofwat about contingency plans for the business because it could be on the brink of collapse. The debt that they are struggling with is reported to be a cool... Are you ready for this? You might want to sit down. A cool £14 billion. This would involve some form of either temporary or permanent renationalisation. So what you would have is a decades-long period during which money had been hoovered out of this company, while, as we know, the maintenance of infrastructure was so poorly executed that we now pump poo into our rivers and our waterways and our seas on a scale that is, I think, unheralded and certainly unprecedented. If it wasn't for Fergal Sharkey, most of us would probably still be unaware that this was going on the scale that it is going on. So they take money out for years and years and years and years and years. I haven't got the exact figures in front of me, but the profits paid to dividends and the salaries paid to chief executives, the latest of whom just quit this week after 2 years in the job. That was after she was asked to forego her bonus over sewage spills at the company. That line there is the one. If I say water company, what do you say? Sewage. I say water company, you say sewage. That's it now. That is the story. That's all we think of. You say water company, we think sewage. And yet somehow the structure of the company was such that the chief executive was still entitled to a bonus. Because her job isn't to keep water clean or to make sure that the amount of sewage being pumped into our waterways. Her job, the thing by which her success is measured, was how much money was making its way into the pockets of shareholders. You know, I saw some Florida politician the other day saying that socialists and communists are not welcome in Florida anymore. If you're a Nazi, don't worry, you're still fine. But if you sort of think that this kind of business model is a little bit reprehensible, then you're not welcome in Florida anymore. It's incredible, right? Someone's pointed out you could buy a whole third of a track and trace system for the amount of money that Thames Water is currently in debt. But that relationship between private and national, the idea that you buy. So I buy some shares in Thames Water. Was it 30 years ago? When was it privatised? Thatcher, was it, or early Major? So I buy some shares in Thames Water. I spend, and I'm not even a big share. Let's pretend I'm a really big shareholder, all right, like a massive. And I spend 30 years just taking money, huge amounts of profit based on my original investment. Then the company buckles under the weight of the debt that it's taken out while giving me money. Yeah? And that's it. It's all over. I don't have to pay anything back. And the government will step in and households will be expected to pay 40% more for their water bills than they currently pay. Now, the point I think we miss, because we're too nice, or because we've been gaslit by all those Tufton Street vampires who pop up on every other programme in the world except this one. We've been so gaslit by those Tufton Street vampires, we don't notice how rank that is. We think that's normal, possibly even inevitable. Say what? Oh, I bought some shares in 1980 whatsits, and they have delivered profits of eye-watering amounts. I've put several children through Eton on my water company shares. And now the company may buckle under the weight of the debt that it's taken out while paying dividends to people like me, and I am not on the hook for any of it. None of it. So, I mean, you couldn't, you couldn't make it up, could you? If you had to write an unfair model and then try to sell it to the British public, I think at this point in the conversation, someone would say, no, wind your neck in, boss. We're never going to get away with that. We at least need to be a little bit more subtle about it. And then you think, no, you don't. No, you don't. What we'll do is we'll make sure that a spokesperson from the Institute of Wizard Wheezes pops up on every programme where water is discussed and says something like, stop taxing success. Or why do you people hate profit? Or, well, that's practically communism. And you just create an environment, a media and political environment, in which rich people can siphon fortunes out of national infrastructure. They're not selling flipping macaroons. This is water. It's hard to think of anything until they find a way of privatising air. It's hard to think of anything more essential to human existence than water, right? So they are siphoning huge profits out of the supply of water to the point where the company perhaps, potentially, reportedly becomes unsustainable, collapses under the weight of debt that has been accrued while these profits have been siphoned, and then none of the people who have been richly remunerated as a consequence of their investments, not a single penny makes its way back from the profiteers to the people, to the public, or indeed to the customers, who will now have to pay more for their water in order to fill the enormous hole left by the debt accrued while they were paying money to the profiteers. Ah, man. You know, I find myself wondering occasionally when I'm going to hang up my headphones. I think it's probably going to be when I stop being shocked by this stuff. Even though we've pointed at it countless times, even though we're aware of it, you feel that little sort of tickle of rage in your heart. And you say, I can't stop. I mean, this is in madness. £14 billion worth of debt. I'll get the number for you in a minute. But I love macaroons, by the way. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest for a minute that there was anything questionable about macaroons. I just got a text that says, James, I sell macaroons. Watch it, mate. I love macaroons. I'm just pointing out that they are a pleasure, aren't they, rather than a necessity. Oh, I'm still digging now. No, they're not. I'm sticking with that. Macaroons are not a necessity. You do not need macaroons to survive. If someone's making a ton of money out of flogging macaroons, good luck to them. Someone's making a ton of money out of flogging water, the least I expect is clean rivers in return for the amount of money that's gone in. But it looks like the government may step in, as they have done with railway companies. Again, we can't spend every hour saying, why doesn't this get reported more? But as they've done with railway companies, shareholders, investors make a ton of money. Company goes south. They don't have to give any of it back. What is it they say? Privatised profit, nationalised debt. God, if Thames Water does go under, you're not going to get a better example, are you? Privatised profit, nationalised debt. 11:11 is the time. First question, pretty obvious. Have I got that right? Is it really that bald? Is it really that bald? Bald? Let's call the whole thing off. Is it? I mean, is that literally what's happened? If you know a little bit more about this sector, am I being naive? Perhaps am I hating profits? Am I sounding like a communist? It's just not right. Again, if it's private sector territory that is non-infrastructural or non-necessity, I would have kept education, maybe certainly transport, water, energy, some bits that you should. Imagine if they tried to privatise all of education. How would we feel about that? Don't care about educating kids, just care about how much money we can make out of the customers. I don't know. Give me a call. Is that what's happened? 0345 6060 973. And sometimes I say, without sounding like an undergraduate Marxist, explain to me how this has been permitted to proceed. But I think today is a day when it's quite good to sound like a undergraduate. Maybe undergraduate Marxists are the only people that have been blowing the bugles and tooting the alarms on the scale that they should have been tooted. It's incredible, right? The government has said it is prepared for a range of scenarios following reports that Thames Water could be on the brink of collapse. Ministers declined to comment on the company's situation, but said regulator Ofwat monitored the financial position of all water firms. This following reports that £14 billion worth of debt. How can you run up that? Okay, can I ask a naive question? You promise not to laugh? How can you be allowed to run up that sort of debt while you're still giving bonuses to the boss? Does that make me sound like an undergraduate Marxist? Seriously, I'm the boss, right? And am I going to get my bonus this year? It'd be like me going to the boss here and saying, I've lost loads of listeners this year. Do I still get my bonus? And the boss would go, yes, James, you do. The more listeners you lose, the bigger the bonus you get. I mean, I get a bonus if my listenership goes up. And that's perfectly as it should be. But somehow if I was borrowing listeners, I don't know if this analogy is going to work with a 2-bit radio presenter, is it? But the point is, how can I be getting a bonus for running the company well when the company is borrowing money to stay afloat? Maybe they were really good at begging. Maybe no one else was going to lend them money. So they went, look, we need £14 billion. Oh, go on then. I like the cut of your jib. Here it is. Sign there. And you go back to the board and you say, I've just managed to get £14 billion worth of debt. And they go, that's fantastic. Have a bonus. Take home a big slice of it. Have a couple of £100,000. There you go. How does that happen? I give up. Well, I don't give up. It's only 11:15. I can't give up until 1. And I've got a podcast to record today, so I can't actually give up until 4 o'clock. But these are my problems. Anyway, the phone lines are open. Let's see if you can make any more sense of this madness than I can. Speaking of problems, I just need to have a quiet chat with a colleague. Have we got any production yet for the what? It's been 24 hours. I want to do Dorries Watch. So what am I going to do? I'm gonna have to. We'll just play Woke Watch again, will we? And I'll shout Dorries over the top of it and pretend that it's a new segment called Dorries Watch. Well, it is a new segment called Dorries Watch, but we'll pretend without letting the listeners know, right? Yeah. That it is production, the sting, the Dorries Watch sting is all brand new. It just sounds a bit like me shouting Dorries over the top of the old Woke Watch sting. Yeah? All right, let's do that after this. Woke Watch. No, I meant after this. 17 minutes after 11 is the time. It's time now for a very exciting new feature on the programme that is called Dorries Watch. Dorries Watch. It is now 19 days since Nadine Dorries promised to resign as an MP with, and I quote, immediate effect. And that is the end of today's Dorries Watch. Yeah, it's good that no one will notice. That's good, that, Keith. Well done, mate. I think we got away with it. Gary's in Knightsbridge. Gary, did I get it right? Is it as bad as it sounds, or is it marginally better, or possibly even worse?
Well, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Loud and clear, Gary.
Yeah, I think obviously the story you're telling is partly true. I think maybe the way you cast the villains and the heroes is probably not quite right.
Fair enough.
Right, because so equity investors put a bunch of money in, and the company.
Are you an equity investor?
I am definitely an equity investor, as most of us are.
Okay.
So equity, not in this, by the way.
No, sure.
But equity investors put money in and expect to get a return, and they take dividends out over time. Fair enough.
Yes, of course. That's all perfectly normal behaviour, and you're right. Everyone with a pension is an equity investor.
Exactly. Now, the company was clearly mismanaged, because I think it's obvious they've been underinvesting in infrastructure, and the proof is in the water that's pouring down my street every other week.
Even in Knightsbridge, Gary, this is serious.
Even in Knightsbridge, so they've been underinvesting in infrastructure. But what's curious is, this is a company that's in $14 billion in debt, which I'm going to assume they weren't at when the company was privatized. No. So clearly, the cash flow from the profits has not been enough to support even the meager capital investments that they're making and the dividends they're paying, right?
Yes, crucially.
And the dividend rate was not particularly, it's probably around 4 or 5%. It's not a particularly high dividend for a utility. So, the business is not producing enough cash to pay the dividends, to pay the salaries, and to make the capital investments. But now when you think about what's going to happen here, James, right, the equity owners are going to get wiped out, as are the debt holders. So, the capitalists, if you will, the evil capitalists, are the ones that are going to get hit by this, and it's the debt holders, right, because they're the ones that are left holding the bag on this.
But the debt holders and the dividend recipients will be different people.
To a degree, they'll be different. You think of it as large funds may own, they'll have investments in both equities and debt. So,
and if the government steps in, who does that help the most? I mean, if this was a non-essential, non-infrastructure company, it would just be allowed to wither and die, right? But that's not going to happen.
No, I mean, the asset obviously will continue on because we need water even in Knightsbridge. But what will happen is the debt holders are going to get given a serious haircut, right? I mean, probably upwards of 80% would be right. Or wiped out completely.
20p in the pound.
I think the good news, James, is that the capitalists are going to get it in the end, right? The equity owners are going to get it.
Well, don't say capitalist, because you're making it sound like and this is my fault as well. This is my simplistic analysis, making it sound like it's a battle between capitalism and communism. It's a question of degrees. For ordinary people listening to this, they will find it, for example, remarkable that the chief executive of Thames Water, who has just resigned, when she joined the company, got a golden hello, I think in excess of £3 million, and she's stayed for 2 years. So
it's absurd. The company's mismanaged. The board is irresponsible.
So hang on, let me just get that last thought out. Being anti that sort of thing does not make you anti-capitalist, does it?
I agree. Yeah. I agree. Yeah, no, I agree. It's crony capitalism, right? You've got a board that's not doing its job, a board that's really not providing proper oversight, paying a chief executive a lot of money for mismanaging a company. And, this is the result. And it's obviously it's not good for capitalists nor socialists.
Or anybody. Or customers or anybody in between. And I think the nuance you've introduced, for which I'm grateful, is that it is as likely to be mismanagement as it is to be, I use the word rinsing or siphoning or sucking as much money out of it as you can in the knowledge that it will eventually buckle. They're two different propositions.
Yeah, I'll be honest. Yeah, I agree, except I would think that the mismanagement is so bad that they don't even understand what the ultimate outcome is going to be. The fact that you can rack up this, and because the thing to keep in mind, this is not a cyclical business. right?
Sure.
Everybody, right? It's not the car business, which is highly cyclical.
Yeah.
So, you know what your business is going to look like going out in time. And so to rack up so much debt that you ultimately find you can't handle it from a cash flow perspective in a non-cyclical utility business is just, it's sort of criminal mismanagement.
Well, it's what regulators are for. It should not be allowed to happen.
Right, and by the way, look at the regulators are incompetent as well.
Yeah,
I mean, the whole thing is just rotten. It really is.
Beautifully explained. Thank you. I'm very grateful.
Thanks, James.
No, seriously, and I hope that may your streets be free of cascading water for the whole of the foreseeable future, Gary. And I like that as well, because obviously he knows more about this world than I do. But that notion of crony capitalism, it's not that profit is bad. Although personally, I would point out that if no money at all was ever being taken out of the company, then all of the money that was made would have gone into investment and infrastructure, to which the traditional and perfectly reasonable response is, yeah, but the company, if no one's making any profits anywhere, the company won't be run very well. To which the perfectly reasonable response is, yeah, but there was lots of money being taken out of the company and the company was being run really badly. So that old argument against nationalisation fails in this instance, but doesn't necessarily fail across the board. 23 minutes after 11 is the time. Stuart's in Sittingbourne. Stuart, what's going on?
Hi, James. Been a listener for a long time.
Thank you.
Never had the BA.
Urge will do, Stuart. Urge. You've never had the urge before.
Urge to ring you. But this has really got my goat, to be honest with you, because I don't know if you can explain to me. I mean, you're the one with private education, not me. But I have been listening. But, what's your definition of a monopoly?
Yeah. No, this is a monopoly. You can't shop around for your water supply.
No, exactly. There's no... I can't go, well, I'm going to go down to the guy down the road because he's got better service than you. I'm literally got to pay for these people to dump what they're dumping in my local beaches and rivers. And it's unbelievable. And then when something comes up, you sort of mention shareholders and monopoly bonuses and stuff, and you think to yourself, well, I'm sorry, they know what their business model is. It's basically just take all the money until there's no money
it falls
left.
apart. Well, Gary offers a slightly different analysis, which is that they're just really bad at this stuff, but both deliver the same
I wouldn't
result.
say that. I've seen that. If anyone's got... if anyone goes into a service, be it public, whatever, then, they're quite clever people, aren't they? They know what they're doing. So for anyone in...
You swore. I just had to dump you, Stuart. But you can't just... it's your debut on the programme, Stu. And your flipping potty mouth ran away with you. Well, that is the word I want to use all the time. I'm talking about sewage, and I manage not to say that word, and then you just use it as a normal expletive when you're not even referring to the sewage.
Oh God, I'm so sorry.
That's all right, mate. Don't do it again.
So am I on or off?
No, you're still here. You're still here. We've lost people.
I'm so sorry.
No, we lost 50. We lost 10 seconds. People just got like a little glitch in the vortex.
Okay, thank you.
But we're fine. We're back
so
now.
Sorry, James.
That's all
I'm
right.
sorry.
Hey, it shows how high your feelings are running, doesn't it?
Well, and hopefully everyone else is, because I really do believe that. Why aren't these? They give them fines. These people that are millionaires that have got so much money that. A 200 grand fine is nothing to them.
Right, factor it in. The chief executive got a £3.1 million golden hello, and she's only stayed for 2 years. 3 years.
How great! I'd like a job like that.
I'll tell you what we should do. We should have a competition to see whose voice can go higher the longer we talk about this.
It does get frustrating, James. I've got to be honest with you.
It really does. It really does.
What I would say to you now is the mismanagement thing is not the right thing. All right, I'm not going to use that word again.
No, don't. But I see what you mean. You see, somebody somewhere has been sitting there rubbing their hands at what has been going on, and I think I probably lean to 52% towards that, as opposed to 100% mismanagement stroke incompetence. I'll give that 48%. It's clearly going to... I think it's almost certainly going to be a little bit of both. The figure I've been given is 37 million in dividends last year alone, and that's where our naivety kicks in, is you don't understand how you can be dishing up millions of pounds worth in dividends, albeit that in percentage terms, as Gary explained, it's quite a small return in percentage terms, but you're divvying that up while running up 14 billion quid's worth of debt. That's the bit that I know that's what you do. That's what a lot of the city boys are doing. They buy things, leverage them to such a degree that they begin to buckle under the weight of the debt that they've taken out. But by then you're in Dubai and you don't care. That's a little bit simplistic, I grant you. And it's not about somehow demonising profit or demonising capitalism. It categorically isn't about that. It's about pointing out where the system needs regulation. And what do this lot keep telling you that we've got too much of in this country? What does Rees-Mogg keep telling you we've got too much of in this country? What do the Brexit backers, the wealthy Brexit backers, tell you that we've got too much of in this country? Yeah, it's not a rhetorical question. I want you all to answer it together. I want the whole class to answer it at the same time, all together now. Regulation. Got to get rid of red tape. It is an absence of regulation that has allowed these water companies, in this case Thames, to behave in this fashion. It is an absence. It is a failure of regulation that has allowed this to transpire. And yet the dominant political mood from Tufton Street to Downing Street is that there is too much regulation and companies must be free to do whatever the hell they want in pursuit of profit, and anybody standing in their way is a communist or part of the enemy within, or woke, or whatever the word is this week that they're using to describe people who understand things and tell the truth. Speaking of people who understand things and tell the truth, it's one of those shows today, isn't it? Because we were talking about Bill Browder and up he popped on the programme, and then I was talking about Fergal Sharkey a moment ago, and he's just DM'd me asking if we want him to come on, so we'll get that teed up during the news bulletin while Thomas Watts brings you the latest headlines. 32 minutes after 11 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We're just sort of sharing a sense of wonderment, really, in a bad way, not good wonderment, bad wonderment. The latest water company shenanigans, in this case Thames Water, looking as if it is close to insolvent. At which point the government steps in, and the people who've been in receipt of dividends and payouts, or bonuses as well, if they work for the company, of course, they walk away into the sunset, and the customer gets hit with a 40% average increase in their water bill moving forward. 32 minutes after 11 is the time. The other people that get hit, of course, are the people that are owed money, the people who have provided the debt. I think it was very helpful of our caller in Knightsbridge to remind us of that. 32 after 11. Paul's in Croydon. Paul, what would you like to say?
What I'd like to say,
yes,
I couldn't say in 2 minutes.
No, don't do that again. Stuart's already used up my swear box.
No, I'm not at that level. I'm a bit more of a global, overall looking at the situation.
Yeah, go on.
Right. You had a couple of callers earlier on, who's sort of talking about capitalists, and we'll end up with the asset at the end of the day.
Yeah.
The missing part of the equation is everyone else is a capitalist but the taxpayer.
Yeah.
There's no legal instrument that allows the taxpayer to be effectively the shareholder of UK PLC, such that the representatives who buy these assets, we originally own them, they sold them without asking the taxpayer.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
Well, I suppose it was probably I think water went in 89, so it would have been in the 87 manifesto probably. So you could argue that we did give permission by electing a government that said they were going to do it.
They said that was one of the things they were going to do. Yeah. That's not what I mean.
I know. I'm just quibbling.
When you're going to sell an asset in a company, like a multinational, you've got a board, right? And then the shareholders are the owners of that business.
Yeah.
Right? And they have a vote as to what wages the board is going to get, what they can do and can't do. The shareholders are sovereign in that company.
Yeah.
We are not sovereigns in our own country. We have no mechanism of saying to the minister, you cannot sell it without our permission. And that's what's not in the law. We are disenfranchised.
But there's no country. There's no country in the world where what you describe would happen.
Doesn't matter. We can be the first, can't we? We were the first in many other things.
Mate, you'd have to have a referendum every day.
It's cheaper than losing
don't want
money.
I hate referendums.
It's cheaper than losing money by these incompetent people at the top.
I listen. We put Tories in power for the last 13 years. There's I'd give it 10 minutes, and everyone would be voting to flog it all off anyway, wouldn't they?
No, they would not.
Yeah, they would. They voted for Brexit because they thought it would make them rich.
Let me give you an example of why they wouldn't do it.
Go on then.
Right.
Yeah.
Thatcher sold a property asset.
Yeah.
I.e., the affordable housing, the council houses and so on, right? Yeah. If you was running a company with such a massive property portfolio and you did what she did, they wouldn't let her get away with it. But she was able to do it without reference to the taxpayer.
No, because the referendum question would be, should council tenants be able to buy their own homes? And you'd get about an 80% win on that, Paul.
But there'd be someone else. They wouldn't be able to necessarily put the question. The question would have to go to a vote, and then that would then be voted on.
But it would
in
go to a vote. No, should council tenants be able to buy their own homes? It would go great guns. You'd be over the line. It would make the referendum result look like small beer.
Exactly, and we've now
What do you mean
learned.
exactly?
Let's say they went that route.
Yeah.
And
then we found out what happened.
Where we've got no council property, where people are basically going out on the street because the situation in the economy has gone such that a lot of people are going to lose their houses and be homeless anyway.
I hope not, but I take
and
your point.
there's nowhere to put them apart from hotels and private accommodation.
Yeah.
Paying twice as much.
So we have another referendum on trying to reverse it.
So people now know that if we buy or if we form a building company that belongs to the taxpayer and they build these properties and they're in the marketplace like all the other capitalists vying for assets and property and they build them and we own them, we know we don't sell them. We know we don't sell them because
they're there for a different purpose from the one that the selling off addresses. I think you're right. I think you're talking about conflicting ideologies, actually, as you know that, not conflicting economic models or policies, but just different ways of looking at society. And, I mean, from here, at this point in time, I think I prefer yours. 11:37 is the time. Fergal's here. Fergal Sharkey, of course, the tireless campaigner in this area. What work? How does it work for you on a day like today, Fergal? Do you? Because I mean, there's vindication here. It's anyone who thought a few years ago that you'd lost your marbles and you were wanging on about chalk streams all the time and water and so there must be an element of vindication, but at the same time, deep dismay.
Well, listen, ultimately days like today are not about winning. It's actually, as you just described it, about dismay.
Yeah.
Yes, were there occasions earlier on where I felt I was shouting at the moon at 3 o'clock in the morning to no one but myself? That probably maybe was true. As it actually happens, James, I'm just doing some work at home and was listening to the show.
Excellent.
Which was what prompted me to wave my hand in the air.
Good man.
Clearly, this is just my interpretation of it, and it's the oversimplified version. In effect, what has gone on, water companies have an operating licence from government, and if government want to revoke that licence, they have to give the water companies 25 years' notice.
Crikey.
Now, what happened was the water companies realised that and effectively have geared up the balance sheets. They've loaned those companies the equivalent of 25 years' worth of profit, which they've paid through to themselves as dividends. So, in effect, they've mortgaged the profit for the company for the next 25 years. Yeah. So not only have they had the 25 years' worth of profit in advance, they've also left these huge debts sitting in these companies, which they can then charge them interest on. So you get a double helping. And that's why the number's been reported this morning at 14 billion for Thames Water. And by the way, Thames Water is just a template. A lot of the rest of the industry has used. If you have a little look through Thames Water's corporate structure and various holding companies, you will come across a company called Kimball Financing Water Limited.
Right.
You can go and look it up in Companies House right now, and you will find that Kimball is actually carrying £21.7 billion worth of debt.
Gosh.
Now, add to that the fact that regulators now confirmed it. We have paid water companies all of the money they needed to meet their legal obligations with regards to the sewage system. The water companies have confirmed that annually to the regulator. They've had the money. clearly hasn't been spent in the sewage system. They've run out of the money. The short version is, James, we've been fleeced, and the water companies have come up with a very intricate engineered system that they've raided those companies. In fact, there's a long article yesterday in the FT focusing on Macquarie.
Yeah.
And just for your listeners, kind of the summary, while Macquarie owned Thames Water, they took out £2.2 billion in dividends, £2 billion in loans, left the company £10.8 billion in debt, a deficit in the pension fund of almost $400 million. We're now exposed, and I think government's going to have to think very long and hard today
about what it's going to do.
Well, I would be absolutely outraged if there's any kind of bailout, and I think the nation should be totally appalled the government would actually in any way try and bail out these companies for their own greed and incompetence.
I suppose the breaking point has come because of interest rates then, because everyone's just quietly ignoring these enormous debts while trousering the dividends, but then when interest rates go north, suddenly servicing this debt becomes unsustainable.
Correct. And that's the water industry this morning is playing this game that they want to put bills up by up to 40%.
Yep.
And that's the insightful question right there I think you've just asked. How much of that increase they need to simply service the debts they've now got sitting in their balance sheet.
So speaking of the FT, Jim Pickard, their rather brilliant political editor, has crunched, deputy political editor, has crunched some of the numbers. So no debt at all when they were privatised, which was in 89, I think. No debt at all. Since then, collectively, they've borrowed £53 billion and paid out £72 billion in dividends.
Correct.
Interest rates spike. Jim Pickard asks, what could possibly go wrong?
Correct. And you want to really, the final kind of just extraordinary thought for the day.
Yes.
Thames Water have obviously appointed an interim chief executive to run the company following the resignation of the one yesterday.
Yes.
Want to know who it is?
Yeah, go on.
The former chief executive of Ofwat, the very regulator who was responsible for creating this sorry mess in the first place.
Or at least for allowing, if not creating. But
there you go. Absolutely.
So, final word then on regulation, because we still hear a lot of political voices telling us that we have too much regulation and we need to be getting rid of regulation. I said a final laugh, not a final guffaw. But that's what we need. We need a regulator that would prevent this sort of thing from happening.
Oh, listen, completely. And when all of this calms down, I genuinely think there needs to be a massive public inquiry and a detailed examination of exactly what was going on with the regulation and the operations of the water industry. Because one way or another, we, the bill payer, are going to end up picking up the tab somewhere down the line.
Of course we are. Always we are. Fergal, thank you. I'm sorry I disturbed your...
That's quite all right, sir. Always a pleasure to speak to you, James.
Likewise, always a pleasure to speak to you. And thank you for the work that you've done in this field. I mean that most sincerely, because it's only from a personal as well as a professional perspective. I think the scale of the imminent problem was first communicated to us by you, 43 after 11. If you want to find out a little more about Fergal's quite bizarre journey from rock god to water campaigner, he was one of my favourite guests on Full Disclosure, I think last year, was it? Last year? And you can find that, of course, wherever you download your podcast. A really lovely interview on Global Player. John's in Christchurch. John, what made you pick up the phone?
Hello, James.
Hello, John.
The last speaker's, Fergal Sharkey, summed up very well. But my key point is that I was looking at the figures a few weeks ago after hearing about the water sewage.
Yes.
The regulator has allowed the nine main water companies, the nine main ones. They've accrued a debt between 1990 and 2018. This is the period that I looked at.
Yeah.
They've accrued a debt that has allowed them to accrue a debt of 57 billion. It's now in excess of 60 billion now.
Right.
But it's just the regulators.
What do they do all day?
It's just ridiculous, and I was just speechless. I'm far from. I would describe myself politically middle of the road or right leaning. I just could not believe it. And they spent the nine main water companies have spent a total of 128 billion over the same period,
is that right?
1990. So the dividends they've paid out has been 57 billion, and the debt they've accrued has been allowed to accrue is around 60 billion over that period.
I had it as 53. borrowed 72 in dividends, but it depends which period you're looking at. But I mean, it is. I mean, to an outsider, and I'm interested. You mentioned right-leaning politics because you think, but when you use that phrase, you mean that you don't want to nationalise everything, and you don't.
No.
But this is just egregious.
It's just outrageous. I mean, and then they're going to fleece us for more.
And Jacob Rees-Mogg will be along in a minute telling us why we need to have fewer regulations, or we need to take power away from regulators because they're undemocratic or something. I don't know what I don't even know what he's on these days. It's 11:45. PMQs on. What happened then? The PMQs on the way. 11:48 is the time. Ben Kent is joining us shortly to steer us through the choppy waters of PMQs. It's all normal, isn't it? I've jinxed it already, a few of you have pointed out, but it should be a good one. Listen, I'm going to let you into a little secret now. When I say PMQs today should be a good one, I'm trying to make sure you keep listening. It's not a genuine prediction or anything like that. I'm not going to say PMQs today, bit rubbish last week. I'd go and put the kettle on, do the washing if I were you. I'd say it's like mind games. I say PMQs should be a good one, and you think, ooh, PMQs, I better stick around at 12 o'clock, not go and do something less boring instead. Little niche reference there to children's television from the 1970s. So PMQs today should be a good one. Ben Kentish will be joining us shortly to steer us through the issues. And it's normal. So it's Starmer versus Sunak. Some reports about what Starmer is likely to do as the general election grows closer, moves ever closer, and he has suggested that he won't focus on or condemn Sunak for being rich or indeed for privately educating his children, but he will be going in more on the inability to relate, to worry over bills. And I think that's going to be interesting. I don't think it necessarily applies to everybody rich. We talk about this a lot. I don't know why I find it so interesting, but I really do, like the relationship between empathy and evidence. But he is going to go in on that. He said, he told the New Statesman yesterday, sometimes you do need to know what it feels like to sit around a table and not know how you're actually going to pay your monthly bills. And Starmer does know that. He's spoken at length about his childhood and his parents and his family. They do know. He does know what it's like. I'm not 100% sure that I agree with him. I don't think I've ever sat around a table and not known what it feels like to not know how you're actually going to pay your monthly bills. I'm not sure. I think growing up there were times where the pips were pretty close to squeaking, but mum and dad would have kept it from us. And I don't know what their families were like before that, but I don't know. I don't know that it is true, but I do think it's probably a good tactic. The other thing that he's revealed is that the attack ads that came out earlier this year have been adjudged by Labour panjandrums to have been hugely successful, and therefore we might be seeing, or we will be seeing, quite a lot more of them. So he puts this into context. I don't know, we're not talking about this today, but he says, I come from a working class family. My dad worked in a factory all his life. That was his working environment. I'd never known any work environment other than the factory until I left home. My mum was a nurse and then she was unable to carry on. So mine was a classic working class family. We holidayed in Britain. We never went abroad. We didn't really eat out very much because there wasn't enough money. This is not a sob story. It's just a story of what it's like to grow up working class. And that is going to be an electoral tactic moving forward. It is back to Thames Water. Tara is in Lewisham. Tara, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Can I just mention to you, I had an email just now, this is off the point, but
go on.
From a friend who said, you must be in heaven, your old heartthrob, Fergal Sharkey, speaking with a man you love, Jacob on LBC.
How
well,
lovely. I love it when the planets align like that, Tara. How delightful.
Well,
gosh, someone knows you very well.
Oh, yes, there it is. I mean, say, my heartbeat calming down.
Good.
In relation to Thames Water, I'll give you my current position swiftly and then how I feel about it politically, if that's all right with you.
Well, we're going to run out of time if you don't crack on soon.
I'll be really quick.
Right.
Okay, so where I live, and I moved in here in Lewisham the January before last.
Yes.
Even before I came here, I didn't have a choice about it, so I guess you can gauge from that how that went. came here and I saw a bit of a problem with the water. Well, there were a bit of waterworks outside, Thames Water, of course. Works going on was the big banner saying this number. And in all this time, I have seen three occasions on which 4 people were doing something, and all they were doing was expanding the network. They haven't actually done anything. My situation now is that I don't have water.
Good Lord. In Lewisham?
I'm on the top floor flat.
And so you're just having to lug it all upstairs in bottles. And they're getting. She got a £3.3 million golden hello when she signed up to the company. Tara, I've got to crack on because Ben Kentish is getting itchy on the other side of the studio, and I have to squeeze in Laurie in Harpenden before we activate the Kentish. Laurie, what would you like to say, mate? Last word probably on this.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things. First of all, when these things came. I used to work in the city as a utility analyst, and the institutions who vote through these on the shareholder meetings, all they were concentrating at any time was what's your dividend cover, what's your payout ratio, what's your gearing level. Well, we're not worried about your gearing because as long as you've got interest cover and you had a secure cash flow, which they did because they had a secure income coming in.
Oh, because people need really water. It's not going to be seasonal, and it's not going to be cyclical, and it's never going to be threatened. So, the day that the equation changes is the day that people don't need water.
But the crazy thing about this is also, if you look at the FTSE 100, it's so incestuous. Everybody's on each other's remuneration board. And then when it goes...
but we can all agree we need less regulation, Laurie, not more. I think we can all agree about that.
Well, the thing is, I think you need two things. You need responsible shareholders who are actually going to vote, say, hang on a sec, we're not voting this through, you're not doing your job, because the regulatory risk is still high, and we need a regulator with teeth.
Yeah, and politicians who are not on the side of the incestuous... business that you've just
the thing is,
rather winningly described.
What you say is if you're an incompetent director, then you do what you do with anyone who's being a crook. You just say, okay, you're not allowed to be on anybody else's board.
Yes.
Scare them.
Yeah, no, I mean, but there we are. It is doable, but of course, the regulations that were brought in after the financial crash in 2008 are on the to-do list of the current government, wanting to turn the clock back, to put less regulation in place to stop the sort of practices that cause the sort of problems that we often find ourselves looking at on this programme. Thank you, Laurie. And listen, it might sound odd, because I sometimes think that can't be right, but why do you think lobby groups exist? Why do you think that anonymous billionaires fund so-called think tanks? And then they pop up on the television, including the BBC, shamefully, to shill for big business without revealing who's funding them. This stuff only happens because you change the conversation, you capture the public space, you have ludicrous organisations like the Institute of Wizard Wheezes putting forward utterly unqualified people to simply say, oh no, big business must be free to do whatever it wants. And they're treated like the other end of the seesaw from someone over there saying, no, it's really not a good idea to let big business do whatever it wants. If you do that, you're going to end up with a sector that has paid out borrowed £53 billion since privatisation in 1989 and paid out £72 billion in dividends. And anyone who can count can see that that's ridiculous. And then you go back to the person from Tufton Street to say that's not ridiculous at all. Why do you hate profits? Are you a communist? And that is how just rinse and repeat. That's how the British media works. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, everybody who called in about that. Ben Kentish is here. PMQs is on the way.
It is, James.
Should we avoid value judgments?
Yes. It's a tricky one this week. There's nothing obvious. There's no obvious topic for Keir Starmer to go on. I think the most obvious is basically what you've just been discussing for the last 50 minutes or so, and tying it in with the rising cost of living, tying it in with the mortgage rate crisis and so on, and trying to ask Rishi Sunak what he's doing about the banks, which are making money, of course, off the higher interest rates that isn't being passed on in the same way when it comes to savings accounts, about the supermarkets, which are profiting from higher food prices, and about the water companies, of course, which we've been hearing could be about to put bills up to 40% to pay for, as you've been discussing, for the work that's needed to remediate some of the dire state of our sewage and our water supply system. It's an obvious attack line for Keir Starmer, drawing the distinction between working people suffering, companies profiteering. It's something
and they
he's
are
hesitant.
profiteering. It's a big part of inflation as well. It's not public sector pay rises because they haven't happened. Inflation's still rocketing, and these companies, it was reported yesterday, I think the IMF pinned it down, that they are increasing prices in excess of what is demanded by interest rate rises.
And what's getting ministers worried is the fact that actually the cost of energy, the cost of supplying and producing the goods we're all buying, James, has come down quite significantly, and that's not filtering through at all in many cases to the prices that people are paying in the shops. Food inflation, for example, up 18% in the last quarter, despite the fact that the cost of producing that food in many areas has come down. That's why Jeremy Hunt's hauled in the chairs of the regulators, 5 regulators this morning, to ask them what's going on. Is this just a natural case of it taking a bit of time for things to filter through? That's not unreasonable. Or is it the case that actually some of these businesses, some of these shops, some of these companies aren't passing on those decreases in the way they should be because they want to make money off them? So it's fertile ground for Keir Starmer, but of course...
But it's dry ground as well. I don't know if that's a mixed metaphor, but it is, I mean, communicating... Talking about people struggling to pay their bills is easy, but somehow tying it to profiteering companies when the government isn't running the company. Do you see what I mean? It's trying to join the dots is trickier than the initial salvo.
It is. That's absolutely true. But they did it quite successfully with the windfall tax with the energy companies. They said and you'll remember, Keir Starmer at PMQs raised this time and time again. People are paying through the roof on their energy bills. These companies are making billions of pounds of profits. What is the government going to do about it? Labour wants a windfall tax. Why don't you, Prime Minister? He did it with Liz Truss. It wasn't Rishi Sunak, actually. It was Boris Johnson. It's Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Forgive me, James. But that sort of language, that sort of message is potentially quite compelling, but, and it's quite a big caveat, this is a party that is very, very keen to make sure that it is seen as on the side of business, that it's not anti-business, that it isn't going to just call for taxes left, right and centre. So I don't think we're going to see the replica or a repeat of what the policy they adopted in the energy companies. But I think a more subtle and more nuanced look, we know some of these companies are still making a lot of money at the same time as people are seeing prices continue to rise, mortgage rates continue to rise, short of just calling people in for meetings, Prime Minister, what are you going to do about it? That sort of attack.
Julie suggests, whose side is Sunak really on? That's quite a good way.
That's the line that we heard Keir Starmer use a lot with Boris Johnson when it came to the energy price rise. It will be tempting, and I say there are reasons he might resist that temptation, but it will be tempting for, given everything in the news this week, him to do something reasonably similar today, James.
We will, of course, cross live to the House of Commons when the Leader of the Opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, gets to his seat and signals the beginning of this week's PMQs. I think there's an urgent question lined up on water from the Shadow Environment Secretary. Do we know anything about that?
Yeah, likely to come after PMQs.
Okay. But again, we shall see what lands, because Sunak is not responsible for what's going on with the water companies. Starmer's job and the Shadow Environment Secretary's job is to seed the narrative that they could be doing a lot more to help people who are struggling. 1 minute after 12. I can't think of anything else really. Anything left field? The problem. It's not a problem, but it's our problem that you would like to see a Tory's feet held to the fire over the Boris Johnson revelations with regard to the KGB spy and the elevation to the House of Lords of the KGB spy's son. But of course, it's Sunak. Starmer won't go there. Would another leader go there? Would another leader try to taint Sunak with the stench of Johnson?
Jeremy Corbyn quite possibly would have gone there, James. Yeah, and there are other stories he could bring in. Of course, it's sensitive and there are complications, but the Daniel Korski allegations, the Conservative Party yesterday were effectively saying we're not going to investigate this. You've got even Brendan Clark-Smith on Twitter.
Oh, tell me a bit about that.
Brendan Clark-Smith insulting a woman who he claimed had previously insulted him when she tweeted a thread of thanks to the Samaritans for being there for her when she was struggling with her mental health at Glastonbury. Again, you've got sort of Tory MPs behaving in a way that Keir Starmer might want to point out is not traditionally how MPs behave, should we put it that way?
Well, I think I saw on your Twitter that the Samaritans had responded.
Samaritans responded. I spent all of yesterday trying to get a quote or a comment from the Conservative Party who simply said, it's one for the whips. This was from number 10. The whip said, we can't comment on any conversations that will be had. So effectively nothing to see here. It's not the sort of thing Keir Starmer, as you say, absolutely rightly will raise at PMQ. It's not really his style. He won't want to see, particularly in the case of a tweet, to just be sort of stooping to that level in a sense. But yes, another Labour leader, you might say, would have gone after those things. I think he's right not to, given the difficulties that everyone are facing. If people are facing him, he stands up at PMQs and asks about something a backbencher has tweeted. It doesn't look the Prime Minister in the way
less so on the Johnson stuff. I've also read that Sunak is planning to go. Well, we'll find out, because here he is.
Mr. Speaker, can I join your tribute to John and wish him all the best on behalf of the House, and join the Prime Minister in his comments about the Holocaust Memorial. I'd also like to wish Muslims across the country a happy Eid. And Mr. Speaker, last week the Labour Party lost Margaret McDonough, our first female General Secretary, and a trailblazer in every sense of the word. Margaret provided guidance, leadership and loyal friendship to so many in the Labour movement. And it wasn't long after I started in this job that Margaret was at my door, and I will be forever grateful for the advice and support that she gave me. We will all miss her terribly. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, his party spent thousands of pounds on adverts attacking plans to build 300,000 new homes a year. At the same time, his housing minister says it's Tory party policy to build 300,000 new homes a year. So is he for building 300,000 new homes a year or against it?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can just remind the honourable gentleman of our record since being in office. 2.2 million additional homes, Mr. Speaker. Housing starts double the number we inherited from the Labour Party. More homes meeting the decent home standards. Housing supply up 10% in the last year that we have figures for. And in the last year we had figures for, we also saw a 20-year high in the number of first-time buyers, Mr. Speaker. That's a Conservative government delivering for this country.
Mr. Speaker, it wasn't a difficult question. Can he point to a single person in housing, in construction, anywhere, who thinks he'll actually hit his target of 300,000 new homes a year? Anyone?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the record is that in the last 3 years, we've delivered almost record numbers of new home building in every one of those years. But Mr. Speaker, he talks about targets, so let's be clear. I promised to put local people in control of new housing. I delivered on that policy within weeks of becoming Prime Minister. But I am confused from the honourable gentleman, because first, the Shadow Community and Housing Secretary said communities should have control. But then he said we should get the targets back and disempower local people. I do want to give him some advice. I don't think it's local people that are the problem. It's a Labour Party policy.
Mr. Speaker, presumably if he could have identified a single person who thought he'd hit his target, he would have told us. And there you have the problem. 1 minute he says he's for building new houses, the next he's campaigning against them. And the truth is, far from delivering, since he crumbled to his backbenchers and scrapped mandatory targets, house building has collapsed. He knows it, they know it, and every expert is telling them it. Why didn't he just admit it? He's not going to get anywhere near his target, is he?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman now claims that he supports house building, especially on the green belt. But unfortunately for him, it's good that he agrees that he does believe that now. But unfortunately for him, the Shadow Deputy Prime Minister, the Shadow Minister for Women, the Shadow Health, Justice, Defence, Business, Northern Ireland and Scotland ministers are all united against more house building in their areas, Mr. Speaker. I have to say to them, though, Mr. Speaker, I would say to them, though, they don't have to worry too much because he's never actually kept a promise he's made.
Mr. Speaker, you can tell from his answer, non-answer, and his body language, he's actually given up. He's given up. And his failure isn't just shattering the dream of those who desperately want to own their own home, it's also hitting those who already have a mortgage. Because of their economic chaos, mortgage holders will be £2,900 a year poorer. How can they ever look the British people in the eye again and claim to be the party of home ownership?
Prime Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't think he's noticed that his shadow housing secretary doesn't actually agree with his new policy of concreting over the green belt, Mr. Speaker. She's been campaigning against developments in her own constituency. She said she wanted to prevent urban sprawl and provide green space for local people. I think that's quite sensible, but it's classic Labour, Mr. Speaker, saying one thing here, doing another thing elsewhere. You simply can't trust a word they say.
At least he isn't claiming they are the party of home ownership anymore, because we are. Mr. Speaker. He's given up. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he's 100% on it. But his definition of 100% on it is to gently ask the banks to do the right thing. His softly approach, refusing to put mandatory measures in place, risks leaving 1 million households without support. How many will have to lose their homes before he'll stand up for the people his party have pushed into economic misery?
Mr. Speaker, in fact, the vast majority of the mortgage market is now covered by the new mortgage charter that the Chancellor's brought in. That is delivering practical help to mortgage holders, allowing them to extend their terms, switch to interest-only mortgage, and actually saving them hundreds of pounds a month. So instead of scaring them, actually, there is now practical support in place. But it's right that he raised home ownership, Mr. Speaker. That's why we, on this side of the House, introduced a 95% mortgage guarantee scheme. It's why we introduced the first homes and shared ownership schemes to get people onto the housing ladder. And crucially, Mr. Speaker, it's why we cut stamp duty. So now what we've seen is the highest number of first-time buyers in 20 years, Mr. Speaker. That is twice the number that the Labour Party ever managed.
Mr. Speaker, it's sort of housing crisis, what crisis with this Prime Minister? He must be the only person in the country who thinks that enough houses have been built in the last 13 years. And whether it's those dreaming of getting the keys to their first home or those already with mortgages, the ambitions of families across the country have been crushed by his failing Tory government. House building at its lowest rate since the war because he can't stand up to his own party. A Tory mortgage bombshell because they crashed the economy. Millions left without support because he won't make lenders put families first. Rather than lecturing the rest of the country on holding their nerve, why doesn't he try and locate his?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as always, he hasn't actually taken the time to understand the detail of what we're doing. So, again, I'm happy to explain it again, Mr. Speaker, because it's right that we provide support for mortgage owners, which is why we improve the generosity of the support for mortgage interest scheme. It's why we've introduced a new mortgage charter, which, by the way, goes much more farther than the Labour Party policy on protecting mortgage holders does. On house building, we're proud to protect the green belt and invest millions more in developing brownfield sites. But, Mr. Speaker, the simple truth is, that's what I said I would do, and that's what we've delivered, and that is the difference between us. I deliver what I promise, he just breaks his.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Labour-run Kirklees Council's local plan is seeing hundreds of homes built on greenfield sites, but the agreed developer levies, the Section 106 agreements, which are supposedly for local infrastructure spending, seem to be disappearing into a black hole. So does the Prime Minister agree with me that agreed infrastructure levies from developers shouldn't be going into a general slush fund? They should be spent on local roads, local schools and local health services for the communities impacted by those developments.
My honourable friend raises an excellent point, and that's why the government is reforming the Section 106 payment system to ensure that new development is matched by new infrastructure, because the current system sees far too little of the developers' profits going to build new schools, hospitals or transport infrastructure. It's also too slow and plagued by uncertainties, and that particularly hampers smaller local developers. So it will be replaced by a new non-negotiable, local determined infrastructure levy, which will deliver exactly what the Honourable Gentleman and others want to see: investment in local communities.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to start by paying tribute to SNP legend Winnie Ewan and Scotland men's national team former manager Craig Brown, who both so sadly passed in recent days, and to all Muslims who are celebrating Eid Mubarak. Mr. Speaker, on Sunday the Prime Minister patronised the public when he told them that in the face of ever-increasing mortgage bills that they simply need to hold their nerve. What a nerve. So may I ask him, the near billionaire, when was the last time that he struggled to pay a bill?
Mr. Speaker, the reason that mortgage rates are rising is because of inflation, Mr. Speaker. That is the root cause, which is why it's absolutely the right policy to tackle, halve inflation and reduce it back to target. Now, that does mean that we do have to make difficult decisions. It does mean we have to be patient while the impact of those decisions actually has an impact. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, as I was explaining previously, we are taking practical steps to support mortgage holders across the United Kingdom, particularly through the SMI scheme and the new mortgage charter.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, that answer confirms what we already know, that this Prime Minister is out of touch and the Tory party is soon to be out of time. And what the public really want is change. But in a week where the Conservative Party and indeed the Labour Party both refuse to accept proposals for public sector pay rises, whilst at the same time accepting the economic damage of Brexit, is it not the case that Westminster does not offer the people real change nor real hope for the future?
Prime Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman just exposes the complete economic illiteracy of the SNP's position. His first question talks about the challenges posed on ordinary families by higher interest rates caused by higher inflation. What does his next question do? Support a policy that would increase government borrowing and make the situation worse. Mr. Speaker, it just demonstrates completely candidly why the SNP's approach to economic management is simply not fit for anyone in the United Kingdom.
Mr. Speaker, local police stations are a key part of communities such as Aldridge in my
For the second week running,
and that's why I continue to
the
make
multifarious voices contributing to PMQs have managed to bring in this segment of the programme bang on time in a way that I managed to achieve despite it usually just being me talking in the first quarter of every hour, I managed to achieve that kind of attention to detail about twice a year, and they've only gone and done it again. 18 minutes after 12 is the time. Let's do it backwards, Ben Kentridge. Stephen Flynn did it. He went in on when did you last struggle to pay a bill? Touch of what Starmer was talking about, having been sitting around the table. Our listeners picking up on the flatness of Rishi Sunak. He did sound defeated, or Starmer suggested that he'd given up, but the text of the day is probably this one. If Sunak was a postman, he'd be sacked for his lack of delivering. Let's start with Starmer. What
clever in a way, James.
I didn't see it coming. Do you think Sunak was surprised?
Yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes. It was one of those weeks where there wasn't an obvious thing to sort of go in on, and Keir Starmer going back to housing, which has worked well for him in the past. I've actually thought he should and could do it more than he did, and he did it very effectively, I thought, today.
Yes.
Talking just very simple questions. The Tories pledged in their last manifesto to build 300,000 homes a year. How's that going?
Yeah,
the reality is last year 204,000, James, were completed, so way short of what was required.
Near record. I love that line.
Near record.
Near record.
Well, he said it's up 10%.
Not really true.
It's up 10% since the middle of the pandemic.
It's funny that, because they were building houses like they were going out of fashion during lockdowns.
It's funny that. Exactly. So that was a slightly dubious use of statistics. But it is a very effective attack line for Keir Starmer. It's an issue that affects almost everybody in some way, or if not directly, then through their children or their grandchildren. The Tories made a very, very clear promise on it. They're nowhere near to meeting that promise. They're almost certainly not going to meet it anytime soon. And the first 2-3 questions, Keir Starmer just pinning it on that. Then he brought in the question of the party of home ownership, making a very clear political point. How can they claim to be the party of home ownership was the question. In response to Rishi Sunak's answer, he said, they're not, we are. So planting his metaphorical political tanks very firmly, again, on an issue, as he's done this quite successfully in the past few months, on an issue, did it with crime. He's trying to do it a bit with immigration too. Now he's doing it with home ownership, stealing their ground. If the Tories, and actually Labour's ahead on a lot of the things that typically the Tories are ahead on, things like taxation, things like crime. Now he's trying to go for home ownership too. Then Keir Starmer brought it on, again, reasonably effectively, to the issue of mortgaging the banks. He did a little bit of what we thought he might do. When will the Prime Minister stop gently asking the banks to do the right thing? When will he act? And focusing on the crisis in mortgages that he then links, of course, to the crisis in home ownership, because they are two sides of the same coin. And he did that effectively. It's also, James, one of the issues where there is clear blue water, clear ground, clear space between the two parties on this. Rishi Sunak, since coming in, has been far more, in some ways, anti-house building than his predecessors. He scrapped Michael Gove's plans to force councils to build a certain number of homes. Of course. He's spoken a lot about the need to give local people control over what is or wasn't built in their area. Boris Johnson and Liz, particularly Liz Truss, were much more of the approach to, forget all that. We just need to build these homes. Keir Starmer has gone out on a limb in a way that sometimes he's a bit reluctant to do, and said Labour would bring back those compulsory house building pledges. So there is a clear difference in policy. Then you had Lisa Nandy in a speech this morning saying what we need to do is build millions or thousands more social homes and affordable homes. So there is a big difference in policy that Keir Starmer can also point to when Rishi Sunak says, well, what would you do? There is something he would do quite differently.
The pushback on the specifics is interesting, isn't it? It's all very well pledging. I've heard someone's asked, are these promises, pledges, or people's priorities? I quite like that. I might be stealing that as a response to these political promises. But specifically saying where are they going to be built? It's the difference between national politics and constituency politics. And he reached for that. Someone presumably handed it to him, or something where he said, these colleagues have all resisted specific new developments in their constituency. So that there's some mileage in that for Sunak.
There is, and Lisa Nandy's faced some fairly probing questions.
So we're all in favour of more houses,
exactly.
Just not in my backyard.
And what Lisa Nandy said in response to that was, well, I want more houses to be built, but they have to be built in the right place. It's true on the Tory side too. You have a lot of MPs saying we need to build more homes, and when there are plans in their constituencies that are unpoppul,
they are always unpopular.
Yes, and this is the problem. Effectively, is that there is at a local level, NIMBYs have a lot of control over what happens in the council area, what happens in terms of what position their MP takes. So yes, you have a lot of politicians on all sides saying, well, we've got to build more homes, but I don't want them in this area in my constituency because my constituents don't like it. It's a part of the reason, not the only reason by any means, but it's part of the reason that we've failed so woefully as a country over decades to build the anywhere near the level of homes that we need.
Well, we've watched him for a while now. Why do you think Sunak had considerably less bounce this week than he has previously, and couldn't even really muster it up?
Because all his attack lines are about, I meet my promises and you don't meet yours. And here he is being asked 3 direct questions about a promise that his party, during his time in a government in which he was a senior member, even before becoming Prime Minister, has by any measure and very clearly failed to meet the promise, James. So it's difficult. It's difficult for him to address that when the question is so specific. Have you met your promise? When are you going to? And who thinks you will? The answer is no, we don't know, and nobody really. So it's difficult. Keir Starmer asked a set of effective questions.
There's no rhetorical flourish to apply there either, is there? I mean, a Johnson could possibly just claim that black was white or up was down, or just make some nonsense about Sir Crashfest Snoozeroonie or whatever. But Sunak is, honest isn't quite the right word I'm looking for. He's not as diabolical. He knows that he'll have that sense in his stomach, won't he? That I can't really get off this particular hook, so I'll just try and say something about him being untrustworthy or something like that.
Yes, and he gave the statistics about certain areas of housing that he claimed have gone better, number of first-time buyers going up, for example. The age at which the average first-time buyer is before they buy homes also going up, James, by several years in the last few years alone.
Yeah,
so
it's kind of
there's statistics on both sides that people can band around. But Starmer he doesn't always do this, but brought it back very successfully and clearly just to that simple pledge. You can talk about other statistics, Prime Minister, but when are you going to build the 300,000 homes that you need? And Rishi Sunak then talking about Labour's broken promises, Keir Starmer's broken promises. He's trying to sow in voters' minds in a way that I think they have had some success in doing, this issue of trust. Can you trust what this man says? He's made a number of promises when he ran for Labour leader. He's made a number of promises since rode back on. And I think that's something you're going to see quite a lot more of. Now he says he will. Now he says he'll bring back those house building targets. But is that another pledge, like quite a few that have gone before it, that Keir Starmer in a few months down the line will say, actually, things have changed. We're not going to do that after all.
I think rent control is one of the latest things to. I don't know whether they'd pledge to do them or to look at them, but they definitely won't be doing them. And now, with no offence intended to his predecessor Ian Blackford, I find myself rather looking forward to Stephen Flynn's interventions. What he's done that perhaps his predecessor didn't is oppose both major parties more clearly. So he never misses an opportunity to have a little dig. He sort of goes for a rabbit punch. So he might swing at Sunak, but then somehow he does a little rabbit punch at Starmer as well at the same time.
Yeah, and he mentions Brexit every week, which is obviously designed to point out the difference between the SNP and not just the Tories, but also Labour too, given their Brexit positions are not wildly different. But yeah, his second question, slightly more reminiscent of Ian Blackford, the idea about Westminster failing Scott. Of course, he's the SNP leader, James. He's got to do that now and again. No one's going to hold that against him. The first one was quite effective. Why doesn't has Rishi Sunak ever had to struggle to pay a bill? A simple question. Rishi Sunak kind of totally dodging it because, frankly, what can he say? He has been asked in the past, have you got a mortgage now? He declined to answer it. He has been asked, have you ever had a mortgage? The answer to that was yes. But clearly, that's again.
For 28 minutes in 2002, before my first Goldman Sachs bonus, but was it Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan? Goldman Sachs?
I think it was Goldman Sachs.
Before my first Goldman Sachs bonus arrived, I did briefly have a mortgage, yes.
And then Stephen Flynn also bringing in the line that Keir Starmer referenced to in his question, Rishi Sunak on Sunday in that interview, urging people to hold their nerve. Keir Starmer saying, why doesn't he try to locate his nerve when it comes to helping people who are struggling with their mortgages? Stephen Flynn going further, accusing him of being patronising towards the British public by using that term, which some Tory MPs I was talking to yesterday, James, were a little bit sort of, why on earth did he say that? They didn't think the tone was quite right.
It was very odd, and it didn't seem to be off the cuff either. I mean, maybe it was off the cuff. Was this in front of IKEA staff? Or was
no, this was an interview on Sunday.
This was in the interview, the Hold Your Nerve. Just a very... So, I mean, we came on air with it at 10 o'clock on Monday morning because it was irresistibly sort of ill-judged.
It was a strange use of language. I think what he was trying to do was get across this sort of sense of hope, of optimism. We'll get through this. Jeremy Hunt that day was writing articles in the Sunday papers talking about they need to be patient. It was a sort of almost a rallying call, almost sort of war cry. We will get through this. Hang in there kind of thing.
Some people speculated he was actually sort of obliquely addressing the party faithful, or either in Parliament or the country.
Or his colleagues.
Or his colleagues. I thought he was talking to himself. I thought it was a little bit of accidental externalisation of internal dialogue. So I don't know whether he plays tapes in the morning and looks at himself in the bathroom mirror and says motivational quotes, Ben. I think it's possible, don't you? I think he looks the type.
What do you think he says?
I think he says, you're a tiger. Hear me roar.
You can do anything you want to do.
Anything, yeah. I am Rishi and nothing frightens me. All of that. And I think he is saying, you've got to hold your nerve, Rishi. You've got to hold your nerve. Which is fine if you're going to be utterly unaffected by the direct personal impact of what's going on. He's got to hold his nerve because he knows numbers will come down again. He knows that hopefully sooner rather than later, regardless of your politics. You'd be mad to want it to go on for longer. He knows they have to come down. He knows that putting interest rates up will bring inflation down. But for him, it's a question of holding his nerve. For other people, it's a completely different proposition.
That's very, very true. And to be fair to him, in the sense of what the government can actually do when it comes to inflation, it is about keeping a limit on spending. They are limited in their scope of what they can do to solve this, which is why some people think it was reckless in hindsight to make it his top priority, given he doesn't have that much direct control over it. So yes, if he's saying to his colleagues, we need to hold our nerve. I understand that when it comes to things like public sector pay demands or other demands for spending in certain areas, there's going to be big pressure pressure to help people with their mortgages, for example. But what we need to do right now is to be as fiscally and as responsible and spend as little money as we can. That's an argument that a decent number of economists, James, would agree with. What damaged him, I think, on that was the suggestion that he was telling other people to hold their nerve, which was the kind of impression that was given in that interview. Because, of course, the question is, well, if you're about to default on your mortgage and potentially lose your house, if you're about to have your gas and electricity turned off, what are you meant to do? And that's why it went down. That's why, I was no surprise that both Keir Starmer and Stephen Flynn brought that phrase up at PMQs. I think it was, in hindsight, something the PM probably slightly regrets using, and I suspect we won't hear him use again.
It's going to haunt him, though, isn't it? And I suppose he could have said, well, I haven't ever actually had to worry about paying a bill, but in solidarity with people who do, I've turned my swimming pool down by 1 degree this week. Because that's going to work. Ben Kentish, always a pleasure. 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox is here with your headlines. 12:34 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Joined now by, well, sometimes when I'm off on my travels, I encounter fascinating people who tell me interesting things, and sometimes they really stick. And I bumped into Missan Harriman a couple of weeks ago in his role as chair of the South Bank Centre, but he was talking to me about something more closely aligned with his role as a Save the Children ambassador. And as we'll discover shortly, Missan's also, as you may already know, a photographer of some repute. But the global hunger crisis, or rather the specific crisis currently in the Horn of Africa, is what you drew my attention to. And you drew it, Missan, by suggesting that it is potentially, if not already, worse than famines and hunger crises that really did capture the attention of the West in the 1980s.
Yes, and thank you for having me, James. It's as bad a crisis as there has ever been in that region, yet the response to it has been one of what I would say collective apathy.
We're looking at Somalia, Ethiopia and Kenya in particular. Suggestions that somebody is dying every 48 seconds from acute hunger. To what do you attribute the apathy?
I think it's a combination of it not being reported in the same urgency as, there's a lot going on in the world.
Yes.
And I think many organizations are not reporting it with the same urgency as they did when I was a child, in the days of Bob Geldof.
Yeah.
And even when we helped avoid hunger crisis in 2017, which the UK played a huge part in, it's been reported a lot less.
Yeah, the 2017 stuff, this was East African famine. UK provided over £800 million. The political picture has changed. Foreign aid in general has been quite successfully demonised by some corners of the media, and so politically possibly there's no mileage in it. The Western politicians don't see any personal advantage to be gained from acting in a way that would, quite literally save lives.
And that's why I'm on this show, because, I will continue to lobby multiple governments, but I believe in the general good nature of the average person. And what I want to say today is of those, people that are dying every 48 seconds, half of them are children. And that's something I am not willing to look away from.
What is Save the Children doing in the region?
I went to Somaliland with Save the Children last year, and I saw the amount of work that they do that empowers local Somali nurses and doctors, ambulance drivers that are working in impossible conditions to help really stabilize already very, very acutely ill children. I saw firsthand that it works. The peanut paste they use to stabilize the hunger so they can get better drugs into the children works. Oh. The local hospitals that are in incredibly arid landscapes work. What is stopping it from working is a lack of resources.
Simple funding. It's just not arriving. It's not happening. Were you prepared for what you saw personally?
No. It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I'm a father of 2 little girls, and to see what I saw at the same time getting back to my hotel and having Wi-Fi, and having my mates ask me, what I saw on Instagram was hard. I spoke to village elders that were, I would say, at least in their 90s, that said they'd never seen 5 years of drought, which speaks to climate change, something that is very much a Western edition rather than what Somali or Somaliland is doing. And I also went to visit local mobile hospitals that had no medicine because of their lack of resources.
And then if rain does come, the land is so ill prepared for it that flooding follows.
Which brings cholera.
I think that the charity is looking to make a £70 million investment immediately. That would treat 1 million acutely malnourished children. And I want, with your help, to unpick those words. When you talk about peanut paste, a sort of protein boost that enables children to respond better or to be treated. You are in the company of children who are teetering upon the edge of death.
Absolutely.
Quite literally that day, in that moment.
Absolutely. And they call them stabilization centers, and to see so many ill children is one thing, but to see the nurses that have the abilities to save their lives and not be able to, and see the helplessness in their eyes, it's something that will stay with me. And my message is it's not always just about money. Support Save the Children if you can, but talk about the fact that every 48 seconds people in the Horn of Africa are dying. And I don't think that discussion is being had, and many people in this country, this will be the first time they even hear of this.
Yes, I had no idea until you told me. I had a vague background noise consciousness of it, but not the specifics. Do you think that, I hope this isn't a crass question, but is there a need for another Bob Geldof? Do we need somebody famous to start shouting and thumping tables?
Well, what I would love beyond Bob Geldof is the power of the reach of social media.
Yes.
Of the top 10 most followed pages on Instagram, half of them are Kardashians, and we have Beyonce and some footballers. But the most followed page is at Instagram with 600 million followers.
Gosh.
If that page alone made a call to action on just one day of the year to say, children are dying, let's do something about it, that will be more powerful than even the Live Aid that you and I grew up with.
That's you're more in touch with the modern movements than I am. I hadn't thought of it working that way around. I didn't even know that Instagram was the biggest account on Instagram. Have you sent out overtures to them?
I've tried everything.
No joy.
No, and I will continue trying.
Well, good luck. And the same with politicians as well. You're kind of knocking on doors and nobody's opening.
And I will continue to do so, and so will Save the Children.
How did you end up in this situation? How did you become an ambassador for Save the Children, and how did you end up in this?
Well, I've been working with them with my photography on local projects in the UK. But when the problem of the Horn of Africa became just frighteningly disturbing, they let me know, and I was like, when can we get on a plane?
How do they talk about it? How do international aid veterans talk about this current unfolding crisis?
Well, I mean, the UN, and using the term famine can be problematic, but which is why we use the term hunger crisis. But it is utterly avoidable. Hunger is a political choice, right? Which is costing the lives of children. And that's how they feel about it. Famines have been avoided.
Yes.
And the UK has helped make famines stop. But it is not doing so with the urgency that's needed today. And the other thing I'll say is the optics of it as well. We are talking about children that are of color. They are black babies, right? And it is very important for me to say this. To have those images that we grew up with, people don't always want to see that.
Sure.
So people look away. And it's not about a judgment. I can understand why you don't want to see that.
Yeah.
But just think about what I'm saying. Children whose lives can be saved, people are looking away.
Yeah. Gosh. How can people look towards it? What are the best ways?
So that if you can't afford to support Save the Children, then speak about it at dinner parties. Post on your TikTok, on your Instagram, even just once. Share it to your WhatsApp group. That is as important. The conversation of the potential biggest loss of life of children in a generation is what I want people. That is a call to action. I believe in the collective power, the network effect of the empathy of the average person in this country.
Well, I do too, despite quite a lot of evidence to the contrary in recent years. You have to keep believing in it, and specifically with, I suppose, via the Save the Children website, people will be able to get a better picture.
All the information's there.
on your way here, it occurred to me in a slight change of gear, but still looking at the question of children going without food, hungry children. On the way here, you would have passed the new entrance to the National Portrait Gallery, where you have a photograph.
Yes,
yourself.
Very surreal for a dyslexic boy who failed every exam to have a picture of mine, of Marcus Rashford, right next to the King of England, King Charles. Pride of place is something I never thought I would ever achieve.
How did that come about?
You know, I was lucky enough to become the first black man to shoot the cover of Vogue. It took 104 years in September 2020. And I went up to Manchester and shot Marcus Rashford and Ado Oboa for the cover of Vogue. And it's an important point because beyond his amazing achievements as an elite athlete on the football pitch, he is well known, deservedly, for not looking away when children were starving in this country. And guess what? The average person in this country followed suit.
And did care. And it's weird, isn't it, that combination of celebrity and altruism. The focus, it's almost like the point of a needle, isn't it? And sometimes the most surprising people pop up. It's an incredible picture. He's an impressive human being.
Empathy, you know. Yes. He had the lived experience. He was one of those kids.
When you're doing, just entirely out of interest, of my own curiosity, and you no idea I was going to ask you this because I had no idea I was going to think it until 5 seconds ago. To complete ignoramuses like me, Miss Anne, what is the difference between a really good portrait photograph and a really ordinary one?
I think there is an unspoken language of vulnerability between those that hold the camera and those that are the subject. They give a piece of their soul to you, and you are the custodian of it. And that's my duty of care as a poet of light.
What an amazing answer. I'm very glad I asked that question. And I'm very glad you could join us today. I pledge to get more across this and to do whatever I can with my social media to keep it in the public space. And you must keep us posted if there's anything else that we can do to help.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And congratulations on the new portrait as well. It's a lovely moment. Miss Anne Harriman, the photographer, activist, chair of the South Bank Centre, and today here in his capacity as a Save the Children ambassador. You can find out more about all of that on the Save the Children website. It's 12:45. .49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The latest shenanigans with Donald Trump are, even by his standards, noteworthy. I'm going to play you a little tape of some audio that CNN have managed to exclusively get hold of, and then we will discuss with the sage watcher of all things American, and now, of course, back covering British politics as well on the Newsagents podcast, John Sopel will talk us through where we are and what this means.
Let me see that. I'll show you an example. He said that I wanted to attack Iran. Isn't it amazing? I have a big pile of papers. This thing just came up. Look. This was him. They presented me this. This is off the record, but they presented me this. This was him. This was the Defense Department and him. Wow. We looked at him. This was him. This wasn't done by me. This was him. All sorts of stuff. It's pages long. Look. Wait a minute. Let's see here. Wait a minute. Yeah. I just found. Isn't that amazing? This totally wins my case, you know. Except it is like highly confidential, secret. This is secret information. But look at this. You attack, and
Hillary would print that out all the time, you know.
she'd send
Private
it,
email.
she'd send it to Anthony Weiner, the pervert.
Please print.
By the way, isn't that incredible?
Yeah.
I was just saying, because we were talking about it, and he said he wanted to attack Iran and what? These are the
You did.
papers.
It's pretty
This was done by the military, given to me. I think we can probably, right?
I don't know. We'll have to see. Yeah, we'll have to try to
Declassify.
figure out a
See, as president, I could have declassified it. Now I can't, but this is classified.
now we have a problem.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
It's so cool. I mean, it's so. Here and I have, and you probably almost didn't believe me, but now you believe me.
No, I believe
It's
you.
incredible, right?
No,
Hey,
they
bring
never
some
had a
cokes
war
in, please.
Bring some what in?
Cokes.
Just every time you thought it couldn't get any more ridiculous, up he pops. And speaking of these sort of parameters of absurdity, John Sopel, you sort of think, well, it can't go beyond the last thing that we thought he couldn't go beyond. And that, as we discussed last time we spoke, it creates this sense of, I don't know quite what the word is, this idea that, well, it washes over us now because there is so much of it, but this is absolutely extraordinary.
Yes, so this is Donald Trump in 2021. He stopped being president. He's helping with someone who is researching a book into his former chief of staff. And so he's taken these people who have got no security clearance, who seem sort of giggly and slightly in awe and slightly fawning towards him. And Donald Trump, you can hear the rustling of papers and him sorting out what he calls highly confidential secret information, and then saying, when I was president, I could have declassified this, but I can't now. Absolutely bang to rights.
Stone cold.
He is handing them, showing them top secret information that is classified, that is about a planned attack on Iran. Now, the problem is, for Donald Trump, is that he's just been indicted for the mishandling of confidential papers. Exhibit A. And if you're in the Department of Justice in Washington and you're bringing this federal prosecution against Donald Trump, you're going to write a thank you letter for giving such absolute gold dust to their prosecution, because this is Donald Trump absolutely openly. And the really fascinating thing about this is I think it's so revealing about Trump the man, in the sense that, was Donald Trump squirreling away secret papers so he could sell them on the dark web or meet someone on a park bench in Lafayette Park and hand them to a Russian agent? No, he just wants to brag.
Yeah.
Look what I've got. Look what I've shown you.
They're
This
like
is
Star Wars figures, aren't they? For an 8-year-old boy.
Exactly. It's kids stuff.
Because they still can't quite believe he ended up president. And here's all the proof.
And here's all the proof. Look what I've got here that will show you what a big, powerful guy I was. And this is the sort of stuff that used to come across my desk. The idea that you would just casually produce to people you do not know top secret government information, it beggars belief. And that is why the case against him is absolutely solid. And, this can't be laughed off as some kind of witch hunt or, the deep state prosecuting him. Everybody knows that this is serious and that Donald Trump has got real problems here. And this tape just absolutely highlights it. It puts a lovely ribbon and a bow on top of the accusations, because what do you do? How do you say anything other than you bang to rights?
Here's me on tape. Here is the defendant on tape describing exactly what he is accused of.
Yeah, exactly.
That's all the lawyer has to do.
And
37 federal charges, 31 of them approved essentially by that audio.
Exactly. And last week he went on the TV, did an interview with Brett Baer from Fox News, and said, did you keep classified documents? He said, well, there were these documents and I didn't give them back because I had my golf stuff in with them. Literally, he said, I had my golf shirts in with them. And so I kind of had to sort that out as well. And so you think, okay, your defence is you retained classified documents that you belong to the government. You didn't have time to sort through because your golf shirts were among them. I mean, it's preposterous.
It is, and you've picked on the bit that's most interesting, the idea of the why of it, the photographs of it all stacked up in his laboratory.
Yeah.
And the sheer amount of it, one box you could imagine possibly for memento value, albeit that it would still be a federal felony. But this idea that it was, I don't know, almost like ego insulation. It was almost him being able to not just look through it, but show it to other people to prove how important. I am a very big deal. That's what it's for. I am a very big deal ammunition.
I am a very big deal, but I'm also extremely chaotic, and that's why they're stacked high in a bathroom. And the defence that was given to that by the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Kevin McCarthy, was, look, they were secure. Bathrooms have a lock on them. Bathrooms have a lock on the inside. They don't have a lock on the outside. You don't go out and lock the bathroom door. You go into the bathroom and
lock it from the inside. So they're safe while you're using the facilities.
So they're safe while you're having a pee. The rest of the time, forget it.
Oh boy, what happens next? I mean, because we knew this tape existed. It's in the indictment, but obviously CNN have got hold of the actual
so this indictment they were hoping that the case could start in August. It won't, because the lawyers that are acting for Trump need to get security clearance to read the papers that are under concern. So that's going to delay
6 months ago, they could have just gone to the lavatory at Mar-a-Lago and read the whole lot of them.
But there are other indictments that are coming down the track, possibly over January the 6th. So Donald Trump's legal woes just continue to pile up, and every time he opens his mouth, he sort of makes it worse.
This is secret information. Look at this. This was done by the military.
And also when he says, it's so cool. It's so cool. Look what I've got. It's so cool.
I don't know if we should laugh for it, but you have to laugh, right? I mean, it is because the word is preposterous.
Yeah, it is preposterous. And it's what we've seen from Donald Trump, and it's why a lot of the crowd love him, because he's total irreverence and total disregard for the norms of behaviour. And why, people who think there needs to be process in kind of running a government and, respect for privacy and top secret documents tear their hair out.
Of course. And no doubt people will be claiming this is a deep fake, or that it's not what it seems.
I don't think anyone can claim that to be a deep fake.
The fans, I mean.
The fans will believe whatever they want to believe.
Of course they will. They have been doing for quite a while. John Sopel, many thanks indeed. As I mentioned, CNN have got hold of that audio if you want to have a listen to. Once again, it's almost as if the vocabulary of political journalism has not got the pages to describe what has actually unfolded, what has actually happened. It's quite breathtaking. I'm told Chris Bryant's just played a blinder in the House of Commons. We might have a little look at that tomorrow if Sheila doesn't look at it today. But I can tell you that is it from me for another day. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also rewind live radio. You'll find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts, including John Sopel's Newsagents. You see? There you go. So I didn't mention it earlier. I'll work it in, make it all sound very natural and fluent.
And then blow it.
And then blow it by pointing out how clever I've been by making it sound natural and fluent. This is what the people want. This is what people have come to expect.
Roll up. Yeah.
So you can rewind live radio. Did you know that? On Global Player.
Quite some time.
Download it for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will with you at 4. Sheila Fogarty is with you now. A bit early, actually, Sheila.
Oh, well.
Look at that. I've given you 10 extra seconds.
That won't kill us, will it?
No, it's fine.
I've got quite a few to claw back,
This is very true. I think I'm still in debit.
Thanks very much, James, and to John as well. 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 Very much, James.